African history of the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. The United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. The United Nations Organization, was formed in October 1945 in San Francisco, USA. Its formation originated from the principles of the Atlantic Charter of 1941. The UNO was formed to replace the defunct League of Nations, which failed to preserve world peace and respect for the rights of man. Unlike the League, UNO was committed to solving the concern of big powers dominating weaker states in the name of imperialism. The UNO therefore got determined to do away with imperialism, foreign domination, which had greatly promoted gross violation of human rights and hence contributed to the outbreak of World War II. The role of the UNO in the growth of African nationalism was hence as follows. Impact of the UNO on African nationalism. Reference questions. How did the formation of UNO inspire African struggle for independence? B. Explain the contributions of the United Nations Organization to the decolonization of Africa. C. Assess the role of the UNO in the growth of African nationalism. 1. The United Nations Organization immediately adopted the resolutions of the 1941 Atlantic Charter, and this influenced the growth of African nationalism. The Chief Charter of the UNO incorporated most of the articles of the Atlantic Charter on independence and sovereign rights. Notable of the resolutions was restoration of the sovereign rights and self-government to those who were deprived of them. Major powers of the UNO called upon foreign governments to give the colonial people in Africa an opportunity to claim for their sovereign equality and independent existence without foreign manipulations. This hence legitimized and formalized African aspirations for self-rule. 3. The UNO set up a Decolonisation committee to ensure that all colonized people of the world were free from all forms of foreign domination. The major role of this committee was to attend to grievances of people in states that were under domination and monitor political developments aimed at preparing these colonies for self-rule. The Decolonisation Committee sent visiting missions to African colonies like Nyasaland, Northern Rhodesia, Somaliland and Libya to supervise independence arrangements and constitutional progress. The committee mounted pressure against European powers to dismantle their colonial empires in Africa and Asia. African history of the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. And constitutional reforms in the mandated states as part of transformation towards self-rule. Hence, African states like Tanganyika, Rwanda, Togo, Libya, Somaliland, and Cameroon immediately independent. The Council sent Commissioner Pelt Adrian to prepare the Libyan independence constitution, and in 1954 it attended to the Tony proposals for self-rule in Tanganyika. Thus independence was given to Libya 1951, Somaliland and Togo 1960, Cameroon and Tanganyika 1961, and Rwanda 1962. 5. The UNO issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Charter (UDR) in 1948, which inspired African agitation for independence. The Human Rights Declaration spelled out fundamental rights and freedoms of all peoples of the world. The rights and freedoms presented in the articles of the UDR included freedoms of speech, association, assembly, press, fair representation, and the sovereign right to independent existence, among others. African freedom fighters used the UDR Charter to rise up and agitate for their rights and freedoms deprived of them by European colonial masters. 6. The UNO declared the years from 1950 to 1960 as a decade 10 years of decolonization. One of the objectives of the UNO was total decolonization and granting of sovereignty and independent existence to all peoples and states under foreign domination. The body hence gave dominating governments a timeline by which they had to initiate political developments which would prepare Africans for self-determination. Therefore, African agitation for political freedoms was influenced by the activities of the United Nations. 7. The United Nations Organization provided African nationalists with a political platform to address their anti-colonial grievances, seek for political guidance, and pressurize imperial powers to end their colonial domination. In 1955, Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika was given an opportunity to address the UN General Assembly and consequently demanded for immediate decolonization of Tanganyika, which was realized later in 1961. In 1966, the SWAPO was allocated a permanent seat in the General Assembly of the UNO to represent the Namibian people, hence Kirina, one of the Namibian nationalists, took up the seat. Such UN efforts encouraged decolonization of Africa. 8. The international peacekeeping body passed strong condemnatory resolutions and imposed strict embargoes and sanctions against stubborn foreign regimes who delayed to withdraw from their colonial territories. The regimes targeted by the UNO included the Portuguese colonial regimes in Angola, Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, the apartheid regime in South Africa and Namibia, and the UDI regime of Ian Smith in southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. The condemnatory African history of the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 9. Consequently, the United Nations Organization passed and emphasized the observation of Resolution 1515 on independence, which had an impact of the growth of African nationalism. The resolution legitimized the right to independent existence of all peoples of the world and denounced all cases of foreign domination exercised against the colonial people. The provisions of Resolution 1515 were adopted by the Liberation Committee of the OAU and used them to condemn Britain for looking on as the minority whites declared themselves independent in southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe at the expense of independence from majority Africans. 10. The UNO directly participated in the decolonization process of Africa through influencing and observing independence discussions between foreign governments and African nationalist organizations. The United Nations initiated such roundtable discussions to ensure a peaceful transition from imperialism to majority rule. In 1974, the UNO sent its delegation to preside over the Alva peace talks between the Portuguese government and Angolan nationalists, which led to the decolonization of Angola in 1975. The UNO was also instrumental in independence discussions in Rwanda, Eritrea, and multiracial peace talks in southern Rhodesia 1978-80, South Africa 1990-94, and Sudan 2005-2011, which resulted in the liberation of majority blacks from racism. 11. The United Nations General Assembly provided a platform for the consolidation of Afro-Asian solidarity. African and Asian delegates always found the opportunity to stand together and use one voice during the sessions of the General Assembly as they condemned domination by Western powers. African nationalists interacted with other nationalists from Asia and the Arab world. Out of this interaction, there was the formation of the Afro-Asian Arab Solidarity. This solidarity or unity enabled the Africans to get support from member states like India and China, which helped them in the struggle for independence. 12. The United Nations worked closely with and through the OAU to ensure territorial independence for Africa. Most of the UN support to the African decolonization process went through the OAU. The UNO and the OAU collectively put pressure on foreign governments in Africa to initiate political reforms in their territories. The OAU used the UN General Assembly to promote the African cause for complete independence. An African delegation consisting of foreign ministers of Liberia, Tunisia, Madagascar, and Sierra Leone was commissioned by the OAU to speak at the meetings of the UN Security Council on addressing the issue of genocide mass killing in Portuguese colonies, which attracted international attention against the atrocities of Portuguese colonialists in Africa and paved way for self-rule in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. African history. The United Nations Organization on the Decolonization of Africa ensured peaceful transfer of instruments of power from foreign governments to natives, hence inspiring African independence. 14. The United Nations Organization recognized African nationalist organizations, political parties, and liberation movements, thus inspiring independence attainment. In 1966, the UN General Assembly agreed to recognize the Southwest African People's Organization SWAPO as the rightful representative of Namibian national interests. Many nationalist organizations consequently petitioned for the intervention of the UNO in favor of their nationalist agitations as a strategy to seek the international body's recognition. In the due course, the UNO morale boosted the struggle for African independence. 15. The UNO extended direct support to the African states struggling for independence. Financial, military, and logistical support was extended to liberation movements through the UN Committee to spearhead nationalist agitations against foreign domination, especially in southern Africa. Beneficial organizations included the Southwest African People's Organization SWAPO of Namibia and the African National Congress ANC of South Africa, consequently the Mozambican Liberation Front Frelimo, the Zimbabwe African National Union's ONU sought for assistance from the UN Security Council during their quest for self-rule. The UNO hence became an ally of the African Liberation Movement, which sped the colonization process. 16. The organization promoted African nationalism by supporting consolidation of African independence. It condemned and intervened in civil wars which broke out in Africa. In 1960, the UNO worked to preserve the independence of a very young state of Congo Leopold Zaire by condemning the Katanga secessionist attempt and went ahead to deploy peacekeepers in the country. The UN mission intervened in the Sudanese Civil War in 1955-2005, Nigerian Civil War of 1967-70 in Angola 90,752,000 and Mozambique 1977-1,992. The 1944 Brazzaville French-African Conference. This was a meeting of senior French colonial officials, governors-general and military officers of French Equatorial Africa, French Congo, Madagascar, Malagasy, and French West African colonies. It was held between January and February 1944 in Brazzaville, the capital of French Equatorial Africa. The conference was organized by General Charles de Gaulle, the French leader, and presided over, chaired by Mr. Plevin, the Commissioner of Colonies. Africans had no delegates to represent them at the conference, but one black man, Felix Abba from French Guiana, attended. The Brazzaville conference was aimed at the following: A. Thank African French colonies for supporting France against German occupation. African history. The United Nations Organization and the Decolonization of Africa. D. Lay strategies of orienting Africans into managing their own affairs. E. It was to safeguard French interests in Africa and preserve French colonies from outside influence. F. To plan for economic development of French colonies. G. De Gaulle also targeted asking Africans for more war contributions since World War. Roman II was not yet over. This was only by promising Africans political changes. Note: the conference was not aimed at preparing Africans for decolonization, hence its positive impact on Africa was by accident. The final resolution at Brazzaville clearly stated that the works of France in her African colonies have no consideration of autonomy, independence, and self-government in near future. Impact of the Brazzaville Conference on the decolonization of Africa. Reference questions. How did the calling of the Brazzaville Conference in 1944 influence the collapse of French rule in Africa? B. Assess the impact of the 1944 Brazzaville Conference on the decolonization of Africa. C. Of what impact was Brazzaville Conference on African nationalism? 1. The Brazzaville Conference increased African representation in the French Parliament National Assembly in Paris. Delegates at the conference resolved that all colonial peoples deserved to represent themselves in the Paris Assembly. Hence, from 1945, French African territories were each required to send 2 representatives to the French National Assembly. The resolution of Africans representing themselves in the French Assembly was later included in the Constitution of the French Fourth Republic. African opportunity to represent themselves in the French Parliament gave them a platform for political agitations geared towards self-determination. 2. The conference led to the enfranchisement of Africans in French colonial territories. The French colonial administrators agreed to grant Africans the right to vote for their representatives to the French Assembly and local parliaments with less colonial influence. As a result, 1 million Africans in the French colonies got empowered to participate in the election of representatives of their choice, like Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast and Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal. The rewarding of Africans with voting rights prompted them to demand for more political rights, including the sovereign right to self-determination. 3. The conference provided for the establishment of native assemblies, territorial parliaments in the French African colonies. These native or local parliaments empowered Africans to play local politics through electing local representatives to discuss solutions to problems created by the French colonial system. In the same African history, the United Nations Organsation and the Decolonisation of Africa. Decolonisation process. These modern political associations were formed either at regional or country level. They included the Independence des Pays IOM and the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain RDA. The RDA was formed in 1946 with representative branches in Equatorial and French West Africa and was very instrumental in influencing political concessions changes. Other parties included Bloc Démocratique Sénégalais XBDS formed in 1948, Union Sardinais US. Parti Démocratique de la Guinée PDG founded in 1947. 5. The Brazzaville Conference promoted the status of Africans in French territories, which inspired African nationalism. The French authorities agreed to grant Africans in French colonies equal status as Frenchmen and also recognize them as equals to French citizens. The abolition of French harsh colonial policies and the granting of Africans voting rights and representation in the French Parliament, as well as spreading French civilization in Africa, were all steps towards granting Africans equal status as Frenchmen. The intention of granting Africans equal status as Frenchmen was aimed at diverting their attention from demanding self-rule, but instead it exposed the weaknesses of French rule, causing African resistance. Out of 16 million Africans in French West Africa, only 1 million could vote, and of the 622 seats in French Parliament, Africans were given only 13 seats. 6. The Brazzaville Conference denounced called to end French atrocities, bad colonial policies which the French government claimed to tarnish the image of France. The conference cautioned the colonial authorities in French, Equatorial and West Africa to reverse the harsh policies in order to win back African trust. Consequently, the policies of forced labor and arbitrary arrests without trial which characterized French colonialism in Africa were officially abolished. The Africans had suffered because of these bad policies, and therefore, when they were abolished, it became a major step towards restoring African freedoms and later influencing Africans to agitate for independence. 7. The conference passed a financial resolution to promote investment and socio-economic development of French West African colonies. Consequently, in 1946, the French government formed the Fund for Investment and Socio-Economic Development of Overseas Territories FIDES to spearhead investment projects in her colonies. Between 1946 and 1957, France had invested about £425 million in West Africa in transport, roads, education and health. Such developments facilitated the road to independence in French colonies of Guinea, Senegal and Ivory Coast, among others. 8. The Brazzaville Conference recommended the extension of French civilization to African history, the United Nations Organsation and the Decolonisation of Africa, of overseas territories in regard to French colonies. The status of African colonies as overseas territories or provinces had destroyed all African hopes of regaining their lost freedoms through constitutional means. Referring to French territories as colonies restored a ray of hope of Africans finally becoming free and independent from French domination. 10. De Gaulle's speech in Brazzaville was of political influence to French Africa. He said, "It is France's duty to raise the Africans to a level where they will be capable of participating in their own country." He therefore commended governors-general in French colonies to recruit Africans in the different administrative departments as well as the civil service. Many Africans got appointed to administrative offices as clerks and administrators, while others served in the civil service. This colonial arrangement exposed Africans to leadership and service, which became a stepping stone to agitate for bigger political roles in their respective states, thus shaking the pillars of French rule. 11. It laid the foundation for the de Gaulle referendum of 1958, which increased hope for independence in French West Africa. Aware of the political agitations across Africa, General de Gaulle decided to determine the fate of French rule in Africa. He began by influencing the formation of the Federation of French Colonies of West Equatorial Africa. In 1958, de Gaulle organized a plebiscite referendum in which French colonies of West Africa would decide to be colonized and lose French support or remain under the French Federation and continue receiving French moral, financial, and technical support. Sékou Touré led the Guineans to vote in favor of independence, and on October 2, 1958, Guinea's was independence declared. Guinea's brevity inspired the independence of other French colonies of West Africa. 12. The unfulfilled promises made at the conference inspired radical activities of Africans towards demanding for independence. The French colonial unrests continued even after the resolutions at Brazzaville. French colonial authorities continued harassing and persecuting African politicians through arrests and shooting masses attending political rallies. Forced labor was only abolished on paper, but mistreatment of African labor continued, especially in the army and on plantations. Africans were hence convinced that French rule was dictatorial, which increased their determination to demand for political freedoms. The contribution of India to the decolonisation of Africa. 1. The connection between Africa and India sets from similar colonial backgrounds, especially with the African British colonies. India and British Africa formed the biggest part of the British colonial empire that existed until the second half of the 19th. African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the decolonisation of Africa. British colonies in Africa shared anti-colonial sentiments of racial inequality, land grabbing, and economic exploitation of native resources. India's independence therefore gave a ray of hope to Africans that decolonisation was inevitable. It was thus very impossible for the British Colonial Office to deny Africans independence after serving India. 2. India's Jawaharlal Nehru served as a political counsellor to African freedom fighters. Many African nationalists sought for political guidance from India after her independence. Upon granting independence to India, the British claimed that Africans were politically immature to receive independence. This forced Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya to consult with Jawaharlal Nehru to enhance their political development. In 1960, the Indian Prime Minister invited Uganda's Apollo Milton Obote to Bangalore, India, and coached him on political leadership. Nehru maintained contact with Kenyatta and for exchanging letters, and in 1948 he appointed Apabi Pound as Indian High Commissioner to Nairobi, whose duties included providing legal advice to nationalists in Kenya. 3. Consequently, India militarized African nationalism. First, India provided military weapons to Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, and later provided a military solution against Portuguese colonialism. In 1962, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru declared a military attack on the Portuguese presence by driving them out of Goa using Indian tanks and artillery. Africans in Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique were inspired to declare war against Portuguese colonial rule in 1963 and 1964 respectively, just like Angola had done earlier on in 1961. African freedom fighters in South Africa and southern Rhodesia combined Gandhiism with Nehru's military approach during the struggle against white domination. 4. Independent India used her position in the UN General Assembly to demand for immediate African decolonisation. India led a group of member countries who voted for an end to colonialism throughout the world. These members of the United Nations came to be known as non-aligned countries. Since joining the United Nations Organization, India directed pressure on different departments of the body like the Decolonisation and the Committee Trusteeship Council. India's pressure to the Decolonisation Committee led to independence of Ghana, while her influence on the Trusteeship Council enabled the timely decolonisation of Tanganyika and Italian Somaliland. India's voice in the United Nations, therefore, became an important instrument against colonialism and racism. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the decolonisation of Africa. 6. Independent India also influenced African nationalism through encouraging the principle of non-alignment or positive neutrality. One of the aims of Non-alignment was the immediate decolonization of the continents of Asia and Africa. Jawaharlal Nehru advocated for positive neutrality of weaker nations mostly from Asia and Africa as a step towards political freedom and economic strength. Non-alignment emphasized non-cooperation of its members with either the Western capitalist or Eastern communist powers. It also encouraged a wide distance between independent states and their former colonial masters. India masterminded the first conference of non-aligned states in the Indonesian city of Bandung. This conference, held in 1955, assured Africans of Asian support and laid the foundation for the Afro-Asian Solidarity Corporation. The Bandung Conference therefore represented the beginning of the final phase of Africa's progress towards independence. 7. India took advantage of her position in the Commonwealth of Nations organization to put pressure on Britain and cause her to enforce total decolonisation in Africa. Soon after her independence, Jawaharlal Nehru, the Indian Prime Minister, influenced the British government to withdraw from the rest of British colonial territories of Asia and Africa. This eventually led to the independence of the British colonies in Africa like the Gold Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanganyika, Kenya, and Nyasaland, Malawi. 8. India sold to Africa Gandhi's policy of using Christianity against colonial exploitation. During the independence struggle of India, Mahatma Gandhi used Christianity and the biblical teachings to condemn colonialism and agitate for equality and liberty which the British colonialists had denied to the Indians. The success of this strategy in India inspired African freedom fighters like Kenneth Kaunda of northern Rhodesia, Zambia, Bishop Sitholen Dabeningi of southern Rhodesia, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa in their campaigns against white racism and colonialism. 9. Gandhi's personality also set a good example to the African nationalists. He was a very good leader and willing to sacrifice himself on behalf of his people and for the sake of independence. As the leader of the independence movement in India, he inspired many African nationalists to borrow his trend of leadership against colonial rule. Examples of African leaders inspired by Gandhi's character included Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika, and Nelson Mandela of South Africa, among others. Mandela's refusal of freedom offered to him by apartheid dictator P.W., both in 1985, was in true sense of a nationalist shaped by Gandhi's dedication to the African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the decolonisation of Africa. Ethiopia had defeated an earlier Italian aggression at Adowa in 1896 during the reign of Emperor Menelik Roman II. The Ethiopian effort to hold on to her 2,000 years independence was stopped in 1936 when she gave into Italian defeat and eventual occupation on May 6, 1936. Italy therefore violated the political virginity of Ethiopia by controlling the Abyssinian country for a period of 5 years. The rise of fascist Mussolini through the famous March to Rome of September 27-30. 1922, and later establishing a dictatorial regime in 1923, created a platform for Italian desire to revenge the Adowa humiliation and consequently re-establish a new Russian empire by controlling Ethiopia. The opportunity came in 1935 and was provoked by the following factors. Reference questions account for the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. B. Mussolini was primarily responsible for the 1935-41 Italo-Ethiopian crisis. Discuss. See how far was the white man's conspiracy responsible for the Italian occupation on Ethiopia between 1935 and 1941. 1. Mussolini's desire to revive Italian imperialism and colonial domination. The invasion of Ethiopia was due to Mussolini's desire to restore Italian domination. The emergence of Benito Mussolini came with his increased ambition of restoring Italian past glory that had been built on the aggressive activities of the defunct former Roman Empire. Mussolini admired and praised the success of the Italian past during the Roman Empire and hence wanted to revive such glories of the Roman Empire. The Italian dictator therefore wanted to re-Nazi and establish a modern Roman Empire by extending Roman influence outside Italy, beginning with Ethiopia. He gave the people of Italy a very ambitious plan which included worshipping the Italian state and acquisition of new territories through a forceful and aggressive foreign policy. 2. The anti-Italian policy of Haile Selassie. Benito Mussolini attacked the Ethiopian monarchy to revenge against Haile Selassie's anti-Italian policy. Since his rise to power as the military governor of Hawa province, Ras Tafari adopted a diplomatic policy which isolated Italy. He completely ignored Italy and Ethiopian foreign relations. Even after signing the 1928 Italo-Ethiopian Treaty of Friendship, Ras Tafari continued isolating Italy, which frustrated Mussolini in 1932. Emperor Selassie recruited foreign advisors from other European powers except Italy. He also appointed economic and military experts from Sweden, France, Switzerland, Belgium, as well as the USA. Mussolini took it personal, hence the 1935 attack on Ethiopia was to enable Italy have influence in Ethiopia. African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the decolonisation of Africa. resurrected the Italian ambition of revenging against Abyssinia with enough confidence that an attack against Ethiopia could arouse the patriotic of Italians towards removing the shameful scar of it all. 4. Need to form the United Italian East African Empire. Mussolini attacked Ethiopia in 1935 with hope of establishing a united Italian East African Empire. During the scramble and partition of Africa, Italy acquired Eritrea and Somaliland, which she wanted to link up by establishing a railway line. Both Italian colonies were near Ethiopia in the Horn of Africa and were at the same time very impoverished compared to Ethiopia, hence of less importance to Italy. Mussolini wished to improve on Italian position in Africa by conquering Ethiopia and joining it with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. Emperor Haile Selassie came to be an obstacle to Mussolini's dream empire as he opposed the railway line passing through Ethiopia. Mussolini therefore found it necessary to annex Ethiopia, add her to Eritrea and Somaliland, so as to effectively establish the united Italian East African Empire. 5. Mussolini's determination to disgrace Ethiopia and enter the pride of the Ethiopian state of 2,000 years of self-rule prompted Italy to attack Ethiopia. By the 20th century, most of the African continent had been shared and controlled by European powers. The two independent exceptions that survived colonialism were the young Republic of Liberia on the West African Atlantic coast, created and supervised by the US government since 1822, and the Abyssinian Ethiopian Empire in the Horn of Africa, whose sovereignty was confirmed after her defeat of Italy in the 1896 Ado battle. Since the rule of Emperor Menelik II, the Ethiopian Empire was proudly isolating Italy in its relations with Europe, especially on matters of diplomacy and military alliances. Mussolini's desire to end the arrogance of the Ethiopian government and disgrace the independent Ethiopian Empire made the Italo-Ethiopian War inevitable. 6. The rise of fascist Mussolini and his desire to spread fascism. The emergence of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his fascist ideology led to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Benito Mussolini developed the political ideology of fascism as means to help restore the social, economic, and cultural life of his country. He formed the National Fascist Party PNF with an aim of promoting military dictatorship, and this shaped his rigid military character. His coming to power led to the acceleration of fascism that promoted the ideology of survival of the fittest and the domination of weaker nations by powerful ones. The desire to spread fascism beyond Italian boundaries made Mussolini to look at Ethiopia as a possible venue. 7. Mussolini's ambition to have full control over Port Massawa and Assab. The need to have full control over Massawa and Assab caused the Italian attack on Ethiopia. Port Massawa was under joint control of the British and Italians, who most of the times failed to agree on patent issues regarding trade on the port. The port combined trade activities among the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. It exported agricultural products, especially nuts, coffee, and hides. The British accessed Port Massawa and Assab from Sudan and through Ethiopia. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia was therefore to claim full control of Ethiopia, deny the British access to ports, thereby eliminating their interest in these ports. 8. The role of the 1934 Walwal Incident. African History, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. At the Walwal Oasis in the Ethiopian territory of Ogaden bordering Italian territory of Somaliland. Fighting occurred at Walwal in December involving Somali officers in the Italian forces and Ethiopian army of about 6,000 men. 2 Italian fighter planes bombed and destroyed the Ethiopian camp, leading to the final conquest of Walwal. Mussolini used the incident to make unrealistic demands to Selassie, which included a written apology, an indemnity compensation of about $20,000 and a delegation of Ethiopian officials to salute the Italian flag at Walwal. Selassie rejected the demands of Mussolini, who hence used it as an excuse to attack Ethiopia the following year. 9. Need to civilize Ethiopia. Italy claimed she attacked Ethiopia due to a civilization mission. Mussolini claimed that the invasion of Ethiopia was not an aggression, but rather it was aimed at promoting European civilization in a primitive and barbaric Ethiopian state. He went ahead to attack the League of Nations for asserting that he had a greedy heart which made him to invade Ethiopia, a member of international peacekeeping body. Mussolini questioned how the League Tribunal could condemn him for civilizing Ethiopia, a backward and uncultured nation that deserved to be civilized. 10. The unfairness of the Versailles peace settlement. The outcomes of the 1919 Versailles peace settlement influenced Italy to attack Ethiopia in 1935. The settlement was made at a conference convened by the victor powers of World War I led by Britain and France. The Versailles settlement was aimed at finding means of punishing Germany and her allies and to reward the allies of victor powers. Germany was hence made to lose her colonial possessions, including the African territory of Southwest Africa, Namibia, Urundi, Togoland, Cameroon, and Tanganyika. These were shared among the victor allies. Italy's hope of getting more territories under her control met a dead end as she came out of the conference empty-handed. This later compelled Mussolini to attack Ethiopia as a means of compensating for the loss of Versailles. 11. Mussolini's ambition to demonstrate Italian military strength. The desire by Italy to exhibit her military strength made 1935 Turco-Ethiopian War inevitable. Italy was regarded as military power since her wars of unification, but the shameful defeat at the hands of Ethiopia during the Battle of Adura in 1896 and the poor performance of the Italian army during World War I greatly affected her military prestige. Italy hence wanted her military strength to be felt once again. The chance came with the rise of Mussolini to power. Mussolini led the determination to raise the military prestige of Italy in the eyes of other powers, and that possible only if he was able to show that his army was not only strong enough to protect Italian boundaries but also to conquer other territories. He embarked on modifying the military sector by manufacturing sophisticated arms and ammunitions, as well as training the Italian troops. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. The Italian spokesperson had to comment that Ethiopia was arming her troops in an updated European manner. This fear made the Italians to appeal to the Italian government, and Mussolini responded by attacking Ethiopia. 13. Impact of economic crisis in Italy. Europe after World War I influenced Mussolini to attack Ethiopia. The after reflects so. World War I were a multiple of economic problems in Europe between 1929 and 1932, and this situation came to be known as the economic crisis. This economic situation severely affected every state in Europe, but the condition of Italy was the unhappy. The war, a high cost of living in Italy with a budget deficit of over 12,000 million lire, $228,000 million, which made it impossible for the government to ensure proper economic planning. The Italian currency lire was depreciated, and employment had greatly increased due to collapse of industries, and many Italians were retrenched from their jobs while wages of those who employed were cut down. Italy had an adverse balance of trade as her import volumes compared to the exports. Such poor economic atmosphere made Mussolini to look at the virgin resources of Ethiopia as the only hope that would stabilize Italy's collapsing economy, hence the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. 14. The unfair Italian share at Berlin. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 had an effect on the outbreak of Italy-Ethiopian conflict. The conference was convened in Germany, organized by Bismarck, the German Chancellor. At Berlin, Africa was partitioned like a piece of cake among the European colonial powers. Italy paid the price of entering the colonial race much later than other powers by acquiring the semi-arid territories of Libya, Eritrea, and Somaliland. Her joining the colonial business late was due to lack of military and industrial resources like other powers. The Italian dissatisfaction at Berlin influenced her attempt to conquer Abyssinia, which failed by 1896. With such unfair share at Berlin, Italy kept alive her dream of controlling Ethiopia, and the opportunity came in 1934–35 during the time of dictator Mussol. 15. The weakness of the League of Nations. The weakness of the League of Nations contributed to the outbreak of the Italo-Ethiopian Wars of 1935. The League was formed on 1920 as an international peacekeeping body. The major aim was to discourage further aggressions of one state over the other. In the charter of the League, it was stated that no country was to attack another member without a strong reason, and if so, the issue would be amicably settled. The League, however, provided for free entry and exit, hence giving Italy an opportunity to withdraw from the League. By the time of Italian aggression on Ethiopia, Italy was no longer a member of the League. 16. Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Influence of Japanese invasion of the Chinese industrial province of Manchuria made Italy to attack Ethiopia in 1935. In September 1931, the Japanese Kwantan Army invaded and occupied Manchuria, whose large agricultural sector turned her into the African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Province. Mussolini found a great excuse to invade Ethiopia while knowing that the principle of collective security was never upheld by the League. 17. Impact of the 1934 Stresa-Front Anglo-French conspiracy. The Stresa-Front and the Italo-Anglo-French alliance gave Mussolini morale to invade Ethiopia. The Stresa-Front was an agreement made during a tripartite conference in the small Italian town of Stresa. It was signed on April 14, 1934 between French Prime Minister Pierre Laval, British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, and Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini. The three states represented as Stresa, France, Britain, and Italy signed the treaty as an alliance again. Sherman rearmament plan, which threatened peace and security in Europe. Mussolini discussed with British delegates his plans of making Italy great, respected and feared through the invasion and conquest of Abyssinia, and ultimately create an all-powerful Italian empire in East Africa. Benito Mussolini believed that the signing of the Stresa Front would mean Britain and France would not interfere in the Italo-Ethiopian crisis. This encouraged him to organize a military invasion on Ethiopia in 1935. 18. The weakness of Ethiopian army. The refusal to sell military hardware to Ethiopia convinced Italy to attack her in 1935. Britain and France refused to sell weapons to Ethiopia at a time when Italy was deploying troops along the Ethiopian border with Somaliland. Even though Selassie had embarked on modernizing the Ethiopian army, Ethiopia could not build a formidable force without acquiring modern weapons. The arms embargo restriction on the sale of ammunition to Italy and Ethiopia favored the former Italy, who manufactured her own arms and ammunition. This biased dishonesty of the European powers gave courage to Italy to attack Ethiopia, as she was aware of Ethiopian military weakness. 1. Need for territories to resettle Italian desperate population. The desire by Italy to acquire new territories for her surplus population led to the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Italy was in need of colonies to resettle hundreds of thousands of her people who were lacking work in their fatherland. Mussolini was concerned that Italians were no longer able to migrate abroad on account of the limitations imposed on immigration by other European countries. He claimed that Italians were hungry for land because they were abundant, productive, and creative. The Ethiopian highlands had good and favorable climatic conditions with fertile arable soils conducive for Italian settlement and agriculture. Such influenced Italy to invade in order to realize economic activities and empower the Italian economy. 2. Desire to exploit Ethiopia. The conquest of Abyssinia would put the country's economic resources into Italian hands. Mussolini was eager to take up control of the all mineral resources in the mountainous country of Abyssinia. The Italian desire for raw materials for her industries and market for her finished good also made it necessary for the invasion and occupation of Ethiopia. The high Ethiopian plateau was conducive for coffee, tea, nuts, and tobacco growing. Ethiopia was also famous for exporting animal hides due to a larger percentage of her population engaging in pastoralism. Mussolini confirmed Italian desire to exploit Ethiopia by claiming that Eritrea and Somaliland lacked the economic potential that other European powers enjoyed in their colonies. 3. Support from Germans. Hitler. German support to Mussolini in his conquest of Abyssinia made the war between Italy, African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa opposed Hitler's ambitious desire to violate the Versailles settlement and annex Austria to Germany. Austrians were also Germans, but at Versailles, the victor powers of the world. War decided to leave Austria independent because the statesman did not want to create a strong and powerful Germany, which would be a source of danger to peace and security in Europe. Mussolini was drawn to Hitler during the Italo-Ethiopian conflict, which convinced him that Germany was a better friend than France and Britain. Whereas the big powers of the world opposed Mussolini for planning an attack on Ethiopia and imposed economic sanctions on Italy, Hitler stood with Mussolini and supported him to occupy Ethiopia. 4. Impact of the Whole-Level Pact. The Whole-Level Pact was a secret proposal made to Benito Mussolini in December 1935 by British Foreign Secretary Samuel Hoare and French Prime Minister Pierre Laval to end the Second Italo-Abyssinian War. Hoare and Laval offered to partition Abyssinia to enable the Italian dictator achieve his goal of turning Abyssinia into an Italian colony. This support to Mussolini was aimed at preventing him from allying with Hitler. By this pact, Italy would gain the best parts of the provinces of Ogaden and Tigray, with economic influence all over the southern region of Abyssinia. Emperor Selassie was to retain control over only the parts of Thin Earth. Mussolini had agreed to the pact because he wanted to end the Abyssinian War, which had continued due to determined nationalistic resistance of the Ethiopians. Even though the Whole-Level Plan was not successful, it assured Mussolini of Anglo-French backing, which encouraged him to have full control of Ethiopia-Abyssinia. Please note, the Whole-Level Pact only confirmed Italian occupation of Ethiopia, but not the outbreak of the war. It was signed in December 1935, 2 months after the war had broken out. Impact of the Italo-Ethiopian War. Reference questions assess the impact of the Italo-Ethiopian War of 1935-41. B. How did the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 affect the people of Ethiopia? Negative effects. 1. Ethiopian resistance was crushed as the Italian troops finally captured the Ethiopian capital, which ended the 2,000 years of Ethiopian independence. By January 1936, the people of Ethiopia had been decisively defeated. However, the Ethiopian army managed to resist the Italian attack for about a few more months, but finally gave in by May 1936 when the Italian army commanded by General Pietro Badoglio entered the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. 2. Consequently, the advancement of Italian troops to Addis Ababa led to the abdication and flight of Emperor Haile Selassie to exile in London, Peru. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 3. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia was a sign of humiliation to the Ethiopian monarch. It was a sign of naked aggression on an internationally recognized sovereign state. The once African symbol of dignity and freedom now fell to the Italian aggressors. The occupation of Ethiopia exposed the military weakness of the imperial regime of Haile Selassie, whose economic constraints could not sustain a resistance against Italy. The Ethiopian reputation built by Emperor Menelik Roman II declined with Italian success over Italy in 1936. It was a sounding success to Benito Mussolini, who inspired the Italian revenge of the Adwa defeat of 1896. 4. The war led to loss of lives and subsequent destruction of property. The use of poisonous gas and aerial bombing left the villages ablaze, where Ethiopians suffered heavy casualties. Many of the victims were innocent women and children. Soldiers, elites, peasants and priests also perished in the Italo-Ethiopian War. 5. The conflict caused and exposed divisions among Ethiopians. The grievances that were held against the Amharic tribe Selassie's origin by other tribes like the Gala, Sidona and Somali due to the tribal tendencies held by the emperor's government made the other tribes to support Italian forces against the Ethiopian National Army. Such gross disunity influenced the Gala to fight the Amharic and the Italians to bribe the Ethiopians to identify the operation areas of the Ethiopian army. The Ethiopian army officials of Gala origin always led their forces into Italian ambushes. 6. The conflict ushered in a political crisis that contributed to the refugee crisis in the Horn of Africa and the emergence of internally displaced people in Ethiopia. This refugee crisis exploded to the neighboring states of Kenya, Sudan, Somalia and Eritrea, where many Ethiopians sought for asylum as Italy occupied Ethiopia. 7. On defeating Ethiopia, the Italians established their imperial rule. The Italian occupation brought Emperor Haile Selassie and the royal imperial house of Ethiopia to experience direct European rule, which other Africa leaders had already experienced about 50 years before. The Ethiopian defeat of Italy at Adwa made the country survive colonial domination and exploitation which other African countries had faced from the second half of the 19th century. Her independence worked to create a sense of peace and prosperity of Ethiopian people within the borders of their own country. However, following the Italian occupation 1936–41, Ethiopians experienced land grabbing, forced labor, and arbitrary rule of a European colonial master. 8. They introduced harsh and exploitative administrative policies like forced labor, excessive coercion, arbitrary arrest, and execution of Ethiopians opposed to Italian African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Ethiopia thus experienced military dictatorship and the uncompromising character of fascist Italians. 10. The Italo-Ethiopian crisis exposed the weakness and double standards of the League of Nations, which inevitably led to its collapse. Later on, the United Nations Organization emerged to roll the boat of peace, security, and justice in the world. Ethiopia received an invitation to the new international world peacekeeping body. 11. The successful occupation of Ethiopia by Italy in 1936 prompted Hitler of Germany to invade Poland, which was a sparkling factor in the outbreak of World War II. The threat posed by the Axis alliance and the refusal of Germany to withdraw from Poland made the Allied alliance led by France and Britain to declare war on Germany, eventually making World War II inevitable. Also 12. The brief Italian colonial occupation of Ethiopia witnessed socio-economic developments in the country. Hospitals, schools, and roads were set up, while Italian settlement led to growth of towns, hence urbanization. 13. The Italo-Ethiopian crisis led to the formation of a guerrilla movement known as the Black Lions under the leadership of Rosemary Meru. This Ethiopian liberation movement stood against ethnic differences in Ethiopia and ensured a successful struggle against Italy. The Black Lions movement made a major contributory factor that led to the defeat of Italy in 1941. 14. The war inspired the formation of a Committee of Union in 1937. This was a step towards promoting unity among over 100 tribes of Ethiopia, as well as ending the divisions within the Ethiopian army that fought against Italian aggression. 15. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia led to international recognition of Emperor Haile Selassie and Ethiopia against Italy. Ethiopia and Haile Selassie became popular all over the world as the international community condemned the Italian naked aggression against an internationally recognized independent state of Ethiopia. Major powers of the League like Britain channeled TA support to enable the restoration of Ethiopian sovereignty. 16. The end of war in 1941 provided the opportunity for the reorganization of the Ethiopian military. Haile Selassie realized the need for a strong modern military force, hence encouraged training of many military officers in modern warfare. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 17. Following the increased international popularity of Ethiopia, the African state got the invitation as a founder member of the United Nations Organization, After World War II in 1945, Ethiopia was invited as one of the founder members of the United Nations Organization. This did not only make the Ethiopian Empire more popular, but also a major contributor to international peace and security. 18. It led to the rise of the Ethiopian Patriotic Church and the increase in its participation in the rational affairs of Ethiopia. The participation of the Ethiopian Patriotic Church in the struggle against the Italian aggressors was paramount in the restoration of Ethiopian sovereignty. The church mobilized the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians to die for their country. In 1938, Bishop Petros was publicly executed for refusing to broadcast against the Patriots. The Italians also killed 380 monks in the ancient monastery of Devralimona as after arms were discovered there. This act of murder on the church officials was a motivation factor in the Ethiopian resistance against the Italian aggression. 19. The Italo-Ethiopian crisis elevated the popularity of Ethiopia among blacks in Africa and the world over. The war strengthened black unity and cooperation towards supporting Ethiopia against Italian occupation. The blacks recognized Ethiopia as the last cathedral of African freedom and thus were profoundly shaken by the destruction of a country that had been a proud symbol of African independence and black achievement amidst the era of colonialism. Protests spread from Lagos in Nigeria to New York in USA and London in England. All over the world, blacks were protesting against Mussolini's naked aggression against a virgin Ethiopia that had stood as a symbol of black freedom of dignity. 20. The war influenced the cooperation of Ethiopia with Eritrea against Italian imperialism. The successful Italian occupation of Ethiopia in 1936 was partly favored by support from Eritrea. However, the good spirit of the Italian colonial government in Eritrea changed soon after Italian conquest of Ethiopia. Mussolini's administration stressed the racial and political superiority of the Italian people in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somaliland. Segregation became the hard and fast rule, and Africans in the three countries were reduced to the lowest class of society in their own homeland. The Eritreans hence worked closely with the Ethiopians to end Italian imperialism. 21. The war awakened racial consciousness of the Ethiopian people that they are Africans and that Ethiopia is part of the African continent. For a long time, Ethiopian rulers preferred seeing themselves as part of the Middle East rather than Africa. The widespread support given by Africans and blacks to Emperor Selassie and the African history of the United Nations Organization and the Decolonisation of Africa. The weakness of the League of Nations exposed the Africans to the white man's conspiracy, i.e., that the Europeans were ready to work together and dominate the blacks. Ethiopia being one of the only two surviving African states to retain her independence and international equality, the Italian invasion was disrespect and breakage of the Ethiopian sovereignty. This influenced the entire black world to come together to oppose and demonstrate their discontentment against Europeans. The blacks hence reacted to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia through the following reference questions. How did the black world respond to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935? We examine the reactions of Africans to the outbreak of the Italo-Ethiopia War of 1935-41. 1. Pan-Africanist like Marcus Garvey immediately spoke out to condemn the invasion of Ethiopia by Italian dictator Mussolini. According to Marcus Garvey, Ethiopia was part of the great African race that was going to help Africans get rid of colonialism. Thus, Italy had committed a naked aggression against an internationally recognized independent country. 2. In West Africa, the nationalistic newspapers called for the mass uprising to protest against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. This was meant to show a mass protest by Africans against European humiliation. 3. In New York, about 20,000 blacks went to the streets to demonstrate against the Italian rape of Ethiopia. This was an indication that blacks in the diaspora abroad still had a strong devotion towards their land of origin. 4. Jomo Kenyatta, in a monthly Labour publication, wrote an article Hand Off Abyssinia. His article was aimed at condemning the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the only symbol and oasis of African independence. Kenyatta commented that his weapon against the Italian naked practice against Ethiopia was only the pen and paper. 5. Consequently, Jomo Kenyatta also vowed never to cut off his beard until Abyssinia was free again. This was aimed at persuading other Africans to involve in supporting the Ethiopian calls for resistance against the Italian occupation. 6. Upon news of the Italian invasion, Kwame Nkrumah walked the streets of London. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Italian claimed to spread Christianity and Western civilization in Ethiopia, but by use of poisonous gas and weapons of human destruction. 8. In West Africa and Nigeria in particular, the Abyssinian Association was formed to support the Ethiopia cause. The association worked to condemn the Italian aggression against Ethiopia and pressurized Britain to favor Ethiopian sovereignty against the ambitions of Mussolini. It tried recruiting volunteers to go and fight on the Ethiopian side. 9. Consequently, the Ethiopian Defense Fund was put in place in Nigeria to help raise logistical, cereal and financial assistance for the liberation of Ethiopia. These resources would later be instrumental in strengthening Ethiopian counter-war against Mussolini's men. 10. West Africans under British rule held a meeting in Lagos to debate British position in the Italo-Ethiopian War. During the Lagos meeting in Nigeria, a resolution was passed asking the British to stop pursuing her appeasement policy towards Mussolini and condemn Italy for occupying Ethiopia. 11. Africans under British colonialism threatened to boycott consumption of British and Syrian goods and to abandon working in government and British firms as a way of showing their discontent to British silence during the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. They interpreted it as a quiet move from old European rule in Ethiopia. 12. In Britain, George Padmore, Dankor, Razmark, and Jomo Kenyatta organised the International African Friends of Ethiopia, AFE, to demonstrate their support towards Haile Selassie and the community in at large. 13. The Jamaica protest was organised by cultural nationalists calling themselves Rastafarians, demonstrated in support of the African personality and showed their concern for Ethiopia. The Rastafarians sang praises of Haile Selassie, the Black Messiah. The leader of the Rastafarian demonstrators was later arrested for selling Haile Selassie's photographs. 14. In 1937, an International African Service Bureau was established to initiate African commitment against colonialism. This was not only to resist Italian occupation of Ethiopia, but at large to oppose European conquest of Africa with a new determination. Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of the Gold Coast, and Hastings Band of Nyasaland were among the members. African History of the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa, as Makonnen to show his attachment towards Ethiopians during their trial moments. Reasons why Italy defeated Ethiopia in 1936. Reference questions. Discuss the factors that led to the Ethiopian defeat by Italy in 1936. B. Account for the military success of the Italians against the Ethiopians between 1935 and 1936. Many factors contributed to the Ethiopian loss of her 2,000 years of independence and included 1. Mussolini took a lot more time to make preparations for an attack on Abyssinia. First, he adopted a rearmament policy by recruiting and training a very large army of more than 500,000 men. He established a military industry to manufacture modern ammunitions. In 1932, he sent a high-ranking Italian official to spy on Ethiopia and report on a possible chance of success in case of an Italian attack. The report given by the Italian spying official indicated that the political situation in Abyssinia were appalling terrible, hence it would not be a difficult task if Italy organized a military attack on this state. From 1934, Mussolini's government spent a reasonable amount of Italian monies to cause conflicts and rebellions among the Ethiopian people in preparation for the war. The clash at war between the armies of Abyssinia and Italy was part of Mussolini's plan to invade and conquer Ethiopia. 2. Ethiopians were grossly disunited, which enabled the Italians to take advantage of them. The people were mostly divided along tribal and religious lines. Ethiopia has a variety of ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. The population comprises more than 100 tribes, with the Amhara Tiger, Oromo Gela, and Somali as the majority. Over 70 languages are spoken in Ethiopia. Sui divisions were also experienced within the army. The army officers from the northern province, like Tigrian province, looked at officers from the southern provinces of Hara and Wollo with suspicion. The Gala warriors, for example, wanted the war to end so fast that they always led the main Ethiopian army towards Italian ambushes. The Italians hence got a better opportunity to facilitate more divisions among Ethiopians by bribing many non-Amharas and influencing them to desert and join Italian army, just like us, while others helped Italian troops to identify the operation areas of the Ethiopian army. 3. The military superiority of the Italians over Ethiopia was a great asset in the defeat and occupation of Ethiopia. The Italians had all sorts of military hardware like powerful bombs, aerial photographs, and a well-organized and trained army of more than 200,000 troops. The people of Abyssinia could not stand the Italian force who African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Armies to weaken Ethiopian troops, penetrate farther into the hilly Ethiopian country and occupy the capital, Addis Ababa. 4. Consequently, the general weakness of the Ethiopian forces enabled the Italian occupation of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian army comprised a total of about 1 million, but a maximum of 100,000 could fight effectively against the invading Italian troops. Majority of the fighters were volunteers with traditional fighting skills. Some of the fighters who volunteered to join the forces only because they wanted food and money. Most of the Ethiopian soldiers that fought the Italian were either sick or old. 1/10 of them were women, another 1/10 were priests who had no strong commitment to the national causes against Mussolini's men. 5. The weakness of the League of Nations was a disadvantage to Ethiopia. The League could not condemn the Italian action, nor could she intervene by sending forces to check the Italian aggression. This left the Ethiopians at the mercy of Italians. The League failed to fix sanctions on Italy as the big powers Britain and France used the organization to achieve their own needs. They recognized the Italian occupation of Ethiopia simply to appease Mussolini. 6. The White Man's conspiracy led to the defeat of Ethiopia. Such conspiracy made Britain and France not to respect the sanctions imposed on Italy by the League. They went ahead to effect the arms embargo, which was a ban on sale of military equipment to Italy and Ethiopia, which solely affected Ethiopia to the advantage of Italy, who manufactured her own weapons. 7. The poor financial status of Ethiopia at the time of the war made the defeat of the Ethiopian army inevitable. The Ethiopian imperial government of Emperor Selassie was so poor that it could not maintain an army in the fighting field for long. It was also expensive to transport fighting men from distant parts of the empire to the areas where fighting took place. The government hardly provided logistical support to the soldiers to ensure that they put up a tough resistance against the Italian invaders. 8. The invasion came at a time when Emperor Haile Selassie was unpopular at home. He was always faced with a lot of opposition, especially from the Gala. There were even rebellions in some provinces like in the north. This made the resistance against the Italian invasion very weak. 9. The poor living conditions of the Ethiopian people led to the Italian victory. There were poor housing facilities, low wages for workers, unemployment and malnutrition, which made the assistance even weaker. This is one of the reasons that African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 11. The fleeing of Emperor Haile Selassie to exile left Ethiopia without a leader to direct any remaining morale of the Ethiopian fighters. If the emperor had not fled, maybe the Ethiopians could have put a commendable resistance against the Italian troops. Instead, the Ethiopian forces had to flee the battlefront while others surrendered to the Italian army, which gave way to the Italian success. 12. Lack of a common strategy amongst Ethiopians led to their failure. The Ethiopian top leaders failed to agree on an effective strategy in organizing a counter-war against the Italians. While the emperor preferred the use of guerrilla tactics and timely retreats, the provincial governors wanted a more conventional war approach. This made the Ethiopian forces to lack proper direction, making their defeat inevitable. Due to the above factors, the Italians could leave no stones unturned. They turned their tables against Ethiopians in revenge of the Edo humiliation of 1896 and were determined to occupy Ethiopia. The defeat of Ethiopia hence became inevitable, mainly due to the disunity of Ethiopians, coupled with the white man's conspiracy and, worst of all, the Ethiopian military weakness. The League of Nations and its failure to prevent the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The League of Nations was a world peacekeeping body established in 1920 following a proposal at the Versailles Peace Settlement of 1919. Its formation followed the suggestion by the President of the USA, Woodrow Wilson, for an internationally recognized peacekeeping body charged with overseeing international peace and security and to ensure that resolution of misunderstanding between and among states was through negotiation and arbitration than aggression. Ethiopia was not a founder member of the League of Nations but registered its membership 4 years later. Upon the Italian threat of invasion, Selassie cried out to the peacekeeping body to intervene before the war erupted. The League, however, gave a deaf ear, thus showing inefficiency. The failure of the League to prevent the Italo-Ethiopian War was due to the following. Reference questions. Why did the League of Nations halt to avert the war between Italy and Ethiopia between 1935 and 1941? B. To what extent did the League of Nations cause the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935? 1. The League showed an impotent response towards the first international tension. This precedent occurred when Japan attacked and occupied the Chinese industrialized province of Manchuria. The unrealistic weaknesses of the League. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Or import arms. However, the very two powers failed to meet the demands of the conference, but the League looked on as they accumulated arms, which gave Italy military confidence to attack Ethiopia. 3. The League of Nations also violated the Geneva Protocol, which had been imposed on the two belligerent countries, Ethiopia and Italy. The two nations were not to import arms, and no member state would connive with either of the two in trade items related to arms and ammunition. However, the sanctions on Italy were violated weeks after items like oil, steel, and coal found their way to Italy from Britain and France. These items were important for Italian arms manufacturing industry. 4. The death of Mr. Briand, the French foreign minister, in 1932 robbed the League of a resolute policymaker. Briand was a major political actor who advocated for a policy of settlement of all conflicts between member states of the League only by peaceful means. Thus, after his death, universal peace remained only a dream as men like Mussolini suddenly woke up to the crude realities of aggression, like the case of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. 5. The weakness of the League of Nations was further witnessed when she failed to restrain aggressive nations from rearming. Italy spent years reorganizing and rearming her military in preparation for an invasion on Italy. Had the League implemented her aims of disarmament, maybe the Italian aggression on Ethiopia could have been averted. 6. The military strength of Italy also scared the League of Nations from intervening to prevent the crisis. Italy had manufactured and bought advanced and sophisticated military hardware such as planes, machines, guns, and bombs. To say that Italy was militarily stronger is not to suggest that the League of Nations was militarily weak, but the League feared military intervention because the cost in terms of blood and resources would have drained the international body. 7. The League also failed to avert the war because Italy was expanding her colonial possession just as other members had done. Britain and France, the major powers of the League, had acquired colonies in a similar manner. They therefore lacked the moral obligation to stop Italy from acquiring more territories in Africa, more so to invade an internationally recognized sovereign of Ethiopia. 8. The negligence on the part of the major powers of the League also rendered the African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 9. Racism in the League led to the Ethiopian occupation by Italy between 1935 and 1941. European members of the League showed very high levels of racism in favor of Italy against Ethiopia. They too seem to have shared Mussolini's argument against Ethiopia that the people of Ethiopia were barbaric, backward, and practiced slavery, and so they needed a dose of European civilization, hence prompting Mussolini to go ahead and invade Ethiopia. 10. The appeasement policy of the major powers of the League of Nations towards Mussolini, i.e., France and Britain, expressed the white man's conspiracy, which instead weakened the effectiveness of the League. They turned a blind eye towards the Ethiopian crisis in order to discourage Mussolini to disorganize Europe. 11. The League of Nations lacked the services of big powers that could have strengthened her stand against the Italian aggression. The League had a principle of free entry and exit, which prompted Germany and Italy to withdraw from the body in 1934. Russia had joined the League in 1934 but left in 1939. The USA, on the other hand, maintained her isolation, so she did not join. This denied the League of ideas and services of these big powers, which could have avoided the crisis. 12. Member states were disunited, suspicious and had mistrust against each other after World War I. This made the League to lack spiritual unity and cooperation that would have prompted successful unity in the body. Thus, when Italy attacked Ethiopia, no power was willing to call for intervention. 13. Members of the League were in deep economic crisis after the Great Economic Depression of 1929 and therefore could not meet the budget of the League effectively. Hence, when the war started, the League of Nations got no meaningful assistance from member states as they worked resolving their own economies. 14. Another contribution of the League towards the defeat of Ethiopia by Italy was that almost all member states, including France and Britain, recognized the Italian government in Ethiopia. The British had confirmed the Italian occupation of Ethiopia through the Whole-Level Pact of 1935, although they condemned Italy at the beginning. Reasons why the Ethiopians defeated Italy in 1941. The defeat of Ethiopians by the Italians in 1936 did not push African resistance to silence. Africans in Ethiopia reorganized under a prominent liberation movement called the Black Lions, led by devoted Rosamuru, together with the defeated Ethiopian forces. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Headed by Mru were in the Ethiopian resistance to Italian aggression. The Black Lions movement mobilized the masses, provided pragmatic strong leadership and ensured solidarity amongst the Ethiopians. The guerrilla tactics employed by the Black Lions humbled the Italians in 1941. 2. The Ethiopians, through tireless patriots like Rose and Mru, forged unity of purpose against the Italians. A committee of union was set up in 1937 to reconcile the antagonistic groups. The Ethiopians hence forgot their cultural and ethnic differences and fought under a general cause. This made the resistance popular amongst all groups of Ethiopian masses. 3. The Ethiopian Patriotic Church played a significant role in the defeat of the Italians. The church mobilized the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians to die for their country. In 1938, Bishop Hedros was publicly executed for refusing to broadcast against the Patriots. The Italians also killed 38 sea monks in the ancient monastery of Debre. The monas after arms were discovered there. This act murder on the church officials was a motivation factor in the Ethiopian resistance against the Italian aggression. 4. The Ethiopians were haunted and motivated by the Graziani massacre of 1937. Marshal Graziani, the Italian viceroy-governor, had announced the distribution of essential commodities to the poor Ethiopians in the city. Unfortunately, some of the members of the Black Lions were hiding in the crowd and threw grenades to Graziani, which injured him severely. The Italian troops retaliated by firing indiscriminately at the crowd and causing chaos in the city. The chaos spread in the country, making the incident one of the major events in colonial history that tarnished the Italian image on the international scene. 5. The Italians carried out oppressive and exploitative policies against the Ethiopians. They forced Ethiopians to offer labor at public works like roads, hospitals, and schools, forced them to grow cash crops, and imposed heavy taxes in Ethiopia. All these increased grievances in Ethiopia and attracted mass support to the anti-Italian uprising. 6. The Italian army was brutal and barbaric, which cost Italian administration dearly. The army burned Ethiopian huts and houses, raped Ethiopian women, including those who surrendered, executed, and buried civilians in mass graves. This made the Italian leadership unpopular ever from Ethiopians who had sympathized with the Italian administration. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 8. The change of mind by the British favoured Ethiopian liberation. The British, soon after Italy joined World War I and II on the side of the Axis alliance, sent assistance to Ethiopians through the neighbouring states of Kenya and Sudan. This British support boosted Ethiopian resistance against Italy. 9. Consequently, the Italian involvement in World War I and II alongside the Axis alliance weakened the hold onto Ethiopia. Italy was occupied in the war with less concentration on Ethiopia. She went ahead to withdraw many of other troops from Ethiopia. The British began viewing Italy as an enemy that deserved to be defeated. Apart from raiding Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, the British extended assistance to Ethiopia, which strengthened her resistance. 10. The stealth return of Emperor Haile Selassie to Ethiopia played a significant part on the side of Ethiopia. Through Sudan, Haile Selassie crossed into Ethiopia in January 1941 to strengthen Ethiopian resistance against Italian aggression. Therefore, the presence of Emperor Selassie boosted the Ethiopian camp that fought with determination until the Italians were thrown out. Impact of the Italo-Ethiopian crisis on the growth of African nationalism, Pan-Africanism. The war had a resounding impact on colonial Africa and the black race in other parts of the world discussed below. Reference questions. How did the Italian attack on Ethiopia in 1935-41 influence the growth of African nationalism? B. Assess the impact of the 1935-41 Italo-Ethiopian War on the growth of African nationalism. 1. Italo-Ethiopian War strengthened black unity and solidarity all over the world against white domination. Black men worldwide were profoundly shaken by the destruction of a country that had been a proud symbol of African independence and black achievement amidst the era of colonialism. 2. The crisis caused political awareness and deepened the calls of African nationalists to struggle for independence. Africans came to know that the whites were determined to completely conquer the African continent mercilessly, and therefore Africans had calls to campaign colonial rule in Africa. 3. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia exposed the white man's conspiracy. Africans. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. The Italians, which included violent attacks on Italian settlers and their installations, were witnessed in Kenya, Angola, Algeria, and British Central Africa, where white property and investments became increasingly the targets of African patriots in the struggle for self-rule. 5. The invasion, a profound revolutionary impact on African nationalists and Nkrumah of the Gold Coast. On reading a heading on a newspaper stand proclaiming a report. Mussolini invades Ethiopia. He lamented that moment. It was as if the whole of London had declared war on me. My nationalism surged to the fore. Jomo. Kenyatta, on the other hand, vowed never to cut off the beard until Ethiopia was free again. All these were expressions of attachment towards Africa and hatred against foreign domination. 6. The crisis sparked off hostile press attacks against colonial rule, mostly in West Africa. Wallace Johnson of Sierra Leone and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria produced a dynamic and explosive article in the press as Africa God. The two were questioning the wisdom of spreading Christianity by use of poisonous gas. Jomo. Kenyatta wrote an article hands off Abyssinia. These articles inspired Africans elsewhere in Africa to agitate for the liberation of Africa. 7. The war militarized African nationalism. It changed the minds of Africans who had opted for peaceful means of transfer of power from colonial rule. The Africans began adopting a similar military approach as the Black Lions, which they thought was the only language the colonial roasters would understand. Case studies are the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya 1952-55 and the FLN War in Algeria 1954. 62. 8. The Italo-Ethiopian crisis was one of the major events that led to the seating of the Manchester Conference in 1945. The Fifth Pan-African Conference at Manchester recognized the means employed by Ethiopians against Italy and demanded for the return of Africans from abroad to lead independent struggles in their respective countries. 9. The crisis provided a platform for Africans to air out their grievances against the evils of colonialism. Emperor Selassie at the League General Assembly stated that the Ethiopian resistance to Italian rule was a case of defending the cause of all. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa, had the vision for worldwide black liberation and regarded Ethiopia as the last cathedral of African collective security and the last piece of land left for Africans. The movement looked urgently for a radical cure of the sickness of colonialism in Africa. The Rastafarian movement therefore militarized the Pan-African movement in its attempt to seek African freedom and independence. 11. The war marked the collapse of the League of Nations and dealt the final nail in the coffin of international collective security, paving way for the formation of the United Nations Organization later in 1945. The UNO adopted a charter that emphasized the equality of all nations and the sovereign rights to independence of states under oppression and domination. 12. Consequently, the Italo-Ethiopian War influenced the outbreak of World War II in 1939–45, which had an impact of African nationalism. Having seen Italy successfully occupying Ethiopia, Hitler led Germany to invade Poland in 1939, which was a sparkling factor in the outbreak of World War II. World War II produced African ex-servicemen who used the military skills acquired from the war to fight against colonialism. 13. The crisis influenced black protests in America. About 20,000 blacks and colored Americans took to the streets in cities like New York to demonstrate against the Italian rape of Ethiopia and showed their support and sympathy to all African states that were under European domination. 14. The Italian invasion of the Ethiopian monarchy influenced the activities of the West African Students' Union WASU in London. Members of WASU organized an Ethiopian committee consisting of J.P. Dankwa, Somali, Jomo Kenyatta, and 5 members from West Indies. The African members later became leaders of the independence movements in their respective countries. The career of Haile Selassie 1930–1974. His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, was born on July 23, 1892 to Ras Makonnen, a cousin brother to Emperor Menelik Roman II. He was born in the province of Harar and was the 225th active successor of the Solomonic dynasty of the descendants of King Solomon and Queen Meta, Queen of Sheba. He went to school at an early age of 5 years, and by 1899 he had started learning French and English. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Title of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie, meaning the power of the Trinity. Other titles adopted by Emperor Selassie included King of Kings and the Conquering Lion of Judah. Achievements of Emperor Haile Selassie. Emperor Selassie was deposed from his throne in 1936 when Ethiopia succumbed to Italian defeat. However, in 1941 a combined force of Indians, Ethiopians and British forces of the King African Rifle KR that Ethiopians defeated the Italian imperial administration. This enabled Haile Selassie to regain his throne. He was bestowed the title of the Lion of the Tribe of Judah upon his return to Ethiopia. Emperor Haile Selassie scored a number of achievements during his reign, hence the Ethiopians referred to him as a man and a modernizer. His achievements included the following. Reference questions. Assess the achievements of Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. V. How successful was Emperor Haile Selassie's reign between 1941 and 1974? C. Examine the changes introduced by Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia from 1941. 1. Immediately after his coronation, Emperor Selassie introduced a constitutional decree that transformed Ethiopia into a constitutional monarchy. The decree became the country's first written constitution in more than 2,000 years. The constitution combined both the country's customs and the cultures of the modern, civilized and educated nations. The principal aim of the constitution was to bring together the people of Ethiopia as one family, united and controlled by one law and governed by one emperor. Haile Selassie was also hopeful the new constitution would create a long period of peace and prosperity in his empire after a series of wars and raids among different tribes. 2. In 1955, the emperor revised the constitution that created a national assembly comprising 2 sections, the upper and lower chambers. The upper chamber comprised mainly members of the royal imperial family and close associates of the Emperor Selassie, while the lower chamber came to be known as the People's Parliament. The revised constitution recognized voting rights of the Ethiopian people, which enabled them to vote for deputies representatives of the lower chamber through the secret ballot. This modern move towards political empowerment of the grassroots masses was an expression of greater democracy. 3. Emperor Selassie successfully established national unity in Ethiopia. Having a united Ethiopian kingdom was Selassie's first major achievement, as he believed that the power of unity would be protected by interests which bind Ethiopians permanently together. He was therefore able to do what other great Ethiopian African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 4. He made a great contribution to his country by ensuring the total abolition of slavery and feudalism in the Ethiopian Empire. Slavery and feudalism had been strong age-old economic institutions encouraged by the previous emperors. Among the wars he fought in Ethiopia in his early years as a regent and later as emperor were mostly against the Ethiopian provincial governors who opposed the emperor's move to provide rights and freedoms to the poor communities in Ethiopia that were victims of oppression due to slavery and feudalism. He also established a department and a school for freed slaves to rehabilitate them from the inferiority complex of enslavement. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 5. Haile Selassie made efforts to modernize the education system of Ethiopia. He established schools and colleges in Addis Ababa and other provincial cities of the empire. He sent Ethiopian students to universities in England, Egypt, France, and Syria. This was aimed at ensuring modern planning of education in the country. Emperor Selassie also upgraded Tafari Makanan Secondary School that he founded in 1925 into a modern education facility. He recruited French and English teachers as instructors in his school. 6. Consequently, the ambition for higher education enabled the emperor to establish Haile Selassie a university. He even allowed a section of his palace in Addis Ababa to accommodate some of the important departments of the university. Foreign professors and expatriates were recruited from France, Belgium, Britain and Sweden to uplift the standards of university education in the country. This was a sign enough to show that Emperor Selassie was not a conservative monarchical leader. 7. Emperor Selassie modernized the health sector of the Ethiopian monarchy. He upgraded the Bethsaida hospital he founded earlier in 1924 into a modern health facility. The emperor set up more hospitals in Addis Ababa and in other provincial cities of the empire. He trained Ethiopian technocrats experts in the field of modern medicine, which was a quick radical move in the field of health. All this was due to his desire for improved health services for his people. 8. Emperor Haile Selassie modernized the Ethiopian military. The process of modernizing the army began in 1932, immediately after the defeat of the Godem Rebellion. The modernization of the army went on as fast as the Ethiopian finances allowed. Selassie recruited military experts from Russia, Belgium and Sweden to train Ethiopian army officers in modern warfare technology. The French and Germans were employed to develop the Ethiopian Air Force. Emperor Haile Selassie sent military cadres to military schools in Egypt, France and England. The emperor also introduced modern military schools to train Ethiopian military generals in modern military intelligence. 9. The emperor was credited for having a liberal attitude towards religion. He had a belief that religion was a personal matter that belonged to all peoples of Ethiopia. To demonstrate this, Emperor Selassie made imperial dominations to the church. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 11. Selassie also emerged as a modernizer in the printing field. He made efforts to transform the Berhane Salam, or Light and Peace, printing press into a modern printing press. He founded press in 1923 during his days as a regent to Emperor Sodatu. The press printed an Amharic newspaper with the title of Berhane Salam. The newspaper published articles popularizing the cause of reforming and modernizing Ethiopia. A steady flow of literature, religious, and educational books in Amharic were published. 12. The emperor introduced modern political structures in Ethiopia where modern and important ministries like finance, internal and foreign affairs, health and communication were established. A council of ministers was also set up to strengthen administration of the empire. Haile Selassie put up a formidable civil service in Ethiopia. All these political developments elevated him to the position of a modernizer. 13. Haile Selassie introduced a school of aviation piloting where Ethiopia trained her own pilots, aircraft engineers and operators. By 1971, of all commercial airlines on the African continent, the Ethiopia airline was fully officered and ran by Africans. 14. The emperor introduced a 5-year development plan in which he involved foreign technocrats to assist Ethiopia in her development programs. These technocrats, experts from European countries like France, Sweden, Belgium, and Britain, as well as from the USA, were an example of a cardinal, very important relationship the emperor had with Europe. Therefore, the ancient empire of Ethiopia shifted to modernity and overall progress. 15. He had a keen interest in all kinds of sports, although with a personal bias in tennis, horseback riding, and hunting. He facilitated sports such that during his regime, Ethiopia produced outstanding sportsmen and women, including the legendary Abebe, a successful long-distance runner. 16. Haile Selassie is remembered for his attitude and care for the unfortunate and unprivileged. Hardly a day could pass without him visiting hospitals, orphanages, and institutions of the disabled. He put some of his earnings in the disposal fund, which was charged with planning and administering institutions of the poor and the sick. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 1924, during his reign as a regent to the Ethiopian throne. This enabled Ethiopia to interact with major European powers like France and Britain at the same level. It enabled Ethiopia to participate in influential decisions at the international level. Being part of the League of Nations also proved that Selassie had great desire for promote Ethiopian foreign affairs relations. The League provided him with a valuable platform in his efforts to defend his country against the fascist Italian attack which greatly threatened Ethiopian independence. 19. As a sign of concern to humanity, the leader of Ethiopia supported the opening up of the Ethiopian branch of the Red Cross. The emperor was impressed by the support given by the Red Cross to the victims of the Italian aggression and occupation of Ethiopia between 1935 and 1941. He therefore gave the body permanent premises in Ethiopia to continue with their humanitarian work towards Ethiopian people. 20. His international popularity led to the invitation of Ethiopia as one of the founder members of the United Nations Organization in 1945. This made the Ethiopian Empire not only popular but also a major contributor to international peace and security. Hence, because of Emperor Haile Selassie, his country became part of the determining powers of modern world affairs. 21. Haile Selassie promoted Pan-Africanism through emphasizing continental unity in Africa. His constructive influence was seen when he worked with Nkrumah of Ghana and Nasser of Egypt to reconcile the Casablanca and Monrovia groupings, leading to the formation of the Organization of African Unity (OAU). The OAU Charter was signed in Addis Ababa on May 25, 1963 under the chair of Haile Selassie. This was a major step towards bringing together different peoples of Africa. 22. Consequently, Emperor Haile Selassie proudly sheltered the permanent headquarters of the OAU in Addis Ababa. This was a memorable symbol of the modern concept of Pan-Africanism that called for unity on the African continent. This move by the emperor made Ethiopia become the center of African politics, replacing Accra of Ghana and Cairo of Egypt. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Treaty signed in 1972 between the Sudanese government and the Anyanya movement. The emperor also mediated in the border dispute between Sudan and Egypt, among others. Weakness of Emperor Haile Selassie. 1. Much as Haile Selassie was regarded a modernizer, he did not live to the expectations of some Ethiopians. Many things went wrong and many factors failed him during his nation-building, for instance. 2. The 1955 revised constitution did not fully democratize Ethiopia. The constitution gave the emperor absolute powers which turned him into a despot dictator. Even when the parliament existed, its pressure was unnoticed. The emperor never allowed political pluralism as it would subject him to criticism. 3. Because the emperor came from the Amhara tribe, the tribe dominated all the affairs of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian masses were expected to speak Amharic as a national language during Haile Selassie's reign. Such exhibition of tribalism was also experienced in the political offices, where nepotism became a formula for stately appointments. Many Amharas maintained sensitive positions in the emperor's government. 4. The emperor made Orthodox Christianity a state religion. Much of his religious attributes were directed to the Orthodox Church. This annoyed the Muslim community, especially in the Eritrean province. The Muslims rallied behind revolutionists to bring about a fundamental change in Ethiopia by 1974. 5. During the era of Emperor Selassie, Ethiopia remained backward. The industrial sector was diminishing. A lot of unemployment existed and Ethiopians experienced poor standards of living. This was partially due to the foreign domination in the economic activities. By the time of his overthrow, the major means of transport in Ethiopia was by horses. 6. Consequently, the emperor employed foreigners as his government advisors. He appointed a Swiss for legal issues, an English advisor for internal affairs, and a Swede for foreign affairs. He also had an American who gave him financial advice. This was a no doubt promotion of neo-Nazi colonialism. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. African History, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. This meant that the period Ethiopia was under Haile Selassie was dominated by undemocratic policies and political anarchy. 9. The emperor failed to reform the land tenure system. The land problem remained constant and affected many of the Ethiopian peasants. The mostly affected people were residents of southern Ethiopia who were landless and stayed under cruel landowners that charged them heavy land dues. Therefore, Ethiopia suffered from feudalism and serfdom during Selassie's reign. 10. Between 1972 and 1974, drought and famine befell Ethiopia and affected many of Ethiopian masses. Among the victims of these catastrophes were the Tiger, Oromo, Somali, and the Eritrean community. The government of Emperor Selassie, however, did little to rescue the situation. Close to 200,000 masses lost their lives. This was one of the unrealistic treatments by Haile Selassie's government that led to its overthrow. 11. Political instabilities in Ethiopia at the time were attributed to Haile Selassie's government. The emperor refused to recognize the internal self-government of Eritrea and the Ogaden claim by Somali residents. These continuously involved the Ethiopian community in war with Eritrea and the Somalia respectively. Many Ethiopians suffered due to these instabilities, which led to unpopularity of the emperor. 12. The emperor was reluctant to improve on the conditions of the army. The soldiers were subjected to poor payment, poor living conditions, and nepotism during the process of promotion. Raised grievances in the army, which prompted young army generals like Haile Mengistu to plot a coup in 1974. 13. The Ethiopian society by 1970 was facing an economic crisis characterized by unemployment, scarcity of essentials commodities, economic stagnation, and acute inflation. This left many Ethiopians starving. The workers received low payments while their fresh graduates could hardly be posted. This prompted many Ethiopians, especially youths, to go on strike, hence exposing the weakness of the emperor as he was aging. 14. Emperor Selassie failed to cut down the high levels of illiteracy. By the time he African history of the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Ethiopia during Haile Selassie's regime to meet the daily necessities of life, therefore leading to poor standards of living. 16. There was too much labour exploitation in Ethiopia during the regime of Haile Selassie. The working conditions were very poor in a country characterized by little pay because the government of Selassie had not regulated a just wage. The workers were also exploited through heavy taxation. 17. Corruption and economic mismanagement ruined the government of Emperor Haile Selassie. Many of his government officials squandered public resources to satisfy their selfish interests. They had little concern to the problems of the masses. The emperor did not attempt to convict the corrupt government officials, which called for military intervention. The downfall of Emperor Haile Selassie. In 1974, the Ethiopian monarchy was ousted overthrown by a group of young army officers. Earlier on, in 1960, Ethiopia experienced an aborted coup for which one of the coup organizers was Haile Selassie's son. The 1960 coup was unsuccessful due to the high military intelligence of the emperor. By December 1973, the situation in Ethiopia was appalling. Many of the masses were suffering. 15. The drought and famine catastrophes were worsening. The aging emperor, at 81 years, was advised to step down, but he refused. In February 1974, a group of uncompromised young army officers led by Mengistu Haile Mariam staged up an army uprising mutiny where they took over the army leadership. The junior officers established a provisional military advisory council Derg to assist the aging emperor in managing the country's affairs. The Derg gradually weakened the powers of the emperor, and by September 1974, Haile Selassie was insignificant in governing Ethiopia. Consequently, members of the Derg, who included Haile Mengistu Mariam, Nofrebate, and Aminandam, staged a coup on September 1974 that finally led to the downfall of Haile Selassie's regime. Upon his overthrow, the emperor was taken from his palace in Addis Ababa and detained in an exclusive prison where he was tortured and mistreated. He died a year later under mysterious circumstances. Causes of the 1974 Ethiopian coup revolution. Reference questions. Account for the downfall of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. B. Discuss the factors which led to the collapse of the Ethiopian monarchy in 1974. C. To what extent did Emperor Haile Selassie contribute to his own downfall? D. Examine the factors for the rise to power of the Derg military junta. E. Account for the rise to power of Mengistu Haile Mariam. 1. The drought and famine catastrophes worsened the situation in Ethiopia, resulting in African history of the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 2. Increased grievances in the army resulting from the appalling conditions made that 1974 coup inevitable. The officials in the army experienced meager payments, poor living conditions in terms of housing and sanitary, and discrimination during the process of promotion. All the grievances influenced the young army generals to turn the tables against the emperor government. 3. The dictatorship of Emperor Selassie caused his downfall. The despotism of Selassie was increased after the 1955 revised constitution, which gave the imperial house absolute powers. The emperor henceforth turned into a dictator. The parliament was dominated and its existence was never recognized. Democracy was abolished and the emperor could not allow political pluralism, as this would bring him to too much criticism. 4. Because he was coming from the Amharic tribe, the emperor led the small tribe to dominate the socio-economic and political affairs of Ethiopia. Most of the lucrative and influential posts in government were given to people of Amharic origin and members of the royal family. This form of nepotism and tribalism forced unprivileged clans and tribes to yearn for change. 5. Consequently, there was increased domination of Amharic cultures, which forced other groups to oppose the emperor's government. The non-Amharic were expected to speak Amharic language and national language during Selassie's regime. Although Amharic cultures were also forced onto the other groups, such that the Oromo, Sidona, and the Eritrean society supported the overthrow of the government of Emperor Haile Selassie. 6. He made Christianity a state religion, with the Orthodox Church dominating Ethiopia, which caused the 1974 coup. Much of the religious attributes were directed towards the Orthodox Church. This annoyed the few Muslims in Ethiopia, especially in the Eritrean province. Some of them rallied behind the revolutionaries to bring about fundamental change. 7. The economic backwardness of Ethiopia made the downfall of Haile Selassie inevitable. By 1974, Ethiopia was one of the most primitive countries in Africa. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 8. Consequently, the economic problems in Ethiopia affected the popularity of Emperor Selassie. There was growth in employment, perhaps due to low levels of industrialization and the collapsing agricultural sector. The masses experienced scarcity of essential commodities and acute inflation. All these increased the suffering of masses and worsened the standards of living. 9. Emperor Selassie adopted a poor foreign policy that led to his downfall. He created an unfavorable relationship with USA, which led to economic exploitation of Ethiopia. Ethiopia was one of the leading coffee producers in Africa, but all her coffee went to USA in exchange for American industrial products. Consequently, the US government determined the price of Ethiopian coffee. Such terms of trade made Ethiopia completely dependent on America. The young Marxist army officers rejected such policy and hence staged up a coup in 1974. 10. Consequently, Emperor Haile Selassie employed foreigners as his government advisors, which caused the popularity of his government. He appointed a Swiss as a legal advisor, an English for internal affairs, an American for financial advice, among others. Together with the continued relationship with Zionist Israel, the emperor was regarded by the Ethiopian masses as an agent of neo-colonialism and Zionism. 11. The increased political instabilities in Ethiopia caused the downfall of the Ethiopian monarchy. The emperor's government failed to solve the armed conflict in the Organsation province. Consequently, the persistent Eritrean crisis since 1961 strained the Ethiopian army that was already concerned with poor welfare. This called for military intervention from the young Marxist officers. 12. The increased violation of human rights by Haile Selassie's government led to the collapse of the Ethiopian monarchy. The people were deprived of freedom of worship, freedom of association, and of assembly. This meant that Ethiopians during the time of Haile Selassie were suffering like the rest of the Africans during colonialism. The emperor had put Ethiopia in a state of confusion and anarchy. 13. Failure by the emperor to reform the land tenure system made his downfall inevitable. The Ethiopian masses, especially of the southern region, either had no land or they were under the control of landlords who charged them high land dues. The poor land policy in Ethiopia was also perpetuated by feudalism and serfdom. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Areas, especially Addis Ababa. This left the villages with almost no one to introduce any changes. The high illiteracy was one of the explanations of the unemployment levels in the country. 15. Consequently, the emergency of the elite class in Ethiopia led to the overthrow of Haile Selassie's government. By 1955, the number of Western-educated people was steadily increasing in the country. The elites were characterized by impatience and the desire for radical changes. The elite class was greatly opposed to Haile Selassie's low pace of change, and this led to the 1974 revolution. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 16. Corruption and economic mismanagement that characterized the government of Haile Selassie made his downfall inevitable. The government officials and the royal family embarked on exploiting and wasting Ethiopian resources for self-satisfaction. Haile Selassie ensured that a lot of resources were channeled for imperial functions. The emperor's tendency of banking a lot of money in foreign financial institutions like the Swiss bank in Geneva made the emperor unpopular, causing the 1974 revolution. 17. Poverty that claimed majority of the Ethiopian population led to military intervention through a coup. The Ethiopian peasants could hardly educate their children, feed them, or clothe them. This was worsened by the poor working conditions in the country that were also experienced in the army. Failure by the government to address the economic problems of the peasants led to the downfall of the Ethiopian monarchy. 18. The overthrow of Haile Selassie was also a result of ambitious interests of young socialist officers, Nafu, Mengistu, and Andam. His military wanted to test power, reform the military, and establish a socialist state in Ethiopia. They detested a conservative and mean Haile Selassie who, despite his aging life, had refused, tossed it down. They formed the Provincial Military Advisory Council in February 1974, which later took over power from Selassie in September 1974. 19. The influence of the earlier successful coups in Africa led to the downfall of Emperor Selassie. The overthrow of Haile Selassie was therefore a demonstration effect. The coups that had an impact on Ethiopia included the 1965 coups in Algeria led by Bamidien against Ben Bella, and Congo led by Mobutu against Kasavubu, the 1966 coups in Nigeria, e.g. the January coup of Igbo officers led by Nzogwu against Tafawa Balewa, and Ghana led by Katoka against Nkrumah, the 1971 coup in Uganda led by Amin against Obote, and the Ghanaian coup of 1972 led by Akampon against Kofi Desir. The aftermath of Haile Selassie's downfall. The 1974 coup in Ethiopia that led to the overthrow of Haile Selassie was followed by a revolution. The Derg immediately established a military government after the 44 years of Selassie's rule. The Derg was however marred with power struggles which saw the earlier Derg leaders like banned and Atnafu being assassinated. Consequently, the over-ambitious Mengistu Mariam also selectively eliminated Andam, a strong rival to the Derg leadership. This left Mengistu Mariam with no serious competitor, and African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Due to what extent did Mengistu Haile Mariam achieve in Ethiopia from 1977 to 1991? 1. The revolution led to the downfall of Haile Selassie and the abrupt end of the Solomonic dynasty. This also brought to an end aristocratic monarchism under the Amhara. Ethiopia received a military regime known as the Provisional Military Advisory Council, which attempted to address the problems of Ethiopia. 2. The new military regime under Haile Mengistu adopted socialist policies aimed at improving the economic and social conditions in Ethiopia. All sectors were nationalized by the government and put under state control. The government then embarked on state planning, which gave her the mandate to take full control of the economy for the benefit of masses. 3. The land tenure system was reformed. The Derg promoted a land program that benefited many households. This was important in the southern part of the country, where close to 700,000 peasant households benefited from this government gesture. In March 1977, a land reform decree was passed where all agricultural land was nationalized without compensation and then redistributed to the peasants. 4. Mengistu and the Derg emphasized infrastructure development. The policy included improving on the building structures, roads, bridges, as well as extending roads and railways lines. This improved on the Ethiopian transport and communication systems, encouraged agriculture, and redeemed the country of backwardness. 5. There was improvement in the provision of social services. For instance, medical services were improved and extended to the rural areas free of charge. The peasants were able to receive adequate medication. The government of Mengistu established more hospitals and health centers in every province as a way of improving on the health conditions for the people. 6. Illiteracy campaigns were carried out following the downfall of Haile Selassie. The campaigns were organized through local associations at the grassroots, although this was still done in Amharic. The literacy rates were consequently reduced from about 95% to 50%. 7. The military regime initiated the establishment of workers' committees and organizations purposely to improve on the conditions of the workers. This also led to the creation of trade unions. As a result, plans to regulate a minimum and just wage for workers were adopted by the government. The socialist policy adopted by Mengistu reduced labor exploitation. 8. The military government led by Mengistu adopted a housing policy aimed at finding solution to the poor housing facilities of the poor peasants. In 1975, all urban houses were nationalized and rent was to be collected by public authority established by government on one's earnings. Urban dwellers were also restricted. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Recognition to publication and all was promoted. This helped in ensuring unity in the country. 11. The government of Mengistu recognized the rights of Eritreans. The Eritreans were allowed to practice Islam, abandon Amharic and English for their local languages, and above all, Mengistu recognized the internal self-government of Eritrea. This brought hope to the coastal Red Sea province and contributed to a ceasefire for some time. 12. There was improvement in agriculture, and this led to increased agricultural production. An increase in coffee exportation was realized, leading to increased national earnings. Growing of tea, tobacco, and nuts was also encouraged to diversify the agricultural sector. State farms were set up to provide more employment to the peasants. All these were attained despite the severe drought that persisted until 1978. 13. The government of Mengistu embarked on mass industrialization. Many industries were set to increase on industrial output and reduce on consumption of foreign goods. Industrialization also improved on the welfare of people through employment. By the end of 1976, the Ministry of NRU controlled the greatest part of manufacturing industries in Ethiopia. 14. Mengistu promoted tourism during his reign. The tourist industry boomed due to cultural pieties of Ethiopia, the scenic beauty, historical sites, and the rich history of the country. Many foreign tourists were attracted, which led to an increase in government revenues. 15. Unlike the government of Haile Selassie, the Derg extended humanitarian aid to the unprivileged and the poor. The government of Mengistu allowed foreign investors and humanitarian workers to operate in the country and assist government to aid the Ethiopian refugees in the famine-ravaged areas. This was a sign of care by the government for the disadvantaged, as Mengistu used the revenues collected from tourism to cater for their welfare. 16. The Derg under Mengistu promoted a resettlement repatriation program in the areas struck by famine and drought, and later floods. In 1976, the program ensured repatriation of about 660,000 people from the areas affected by drought to areas with fertile soils in the north and the east. Weaknesses, shortcomings of Mengistu and the Derg. Much as the political, social, and economic policies of the Derg reformed Ethiopia, the regime under Mengistu faced several problems. Mengistu failed to solve many of the problems, hence the Derg could not keep standing. In 1991, after a long period of fighting, Meles Zenawi and the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, with assistance from the Eritrean Popular Liberation Front of Isaias Afwerki, captured power and caused the collapse of the Derg. The weakness of the military government under Mengistu Mariam included the following: African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 2. Consequently, the Derg was faced with hostilities from the former ruling class and sympathizers of Haile Selassie. They later formed the Ethiopian Democratic Union (EDU) and cooperated with the anti-Marxist Sudanese government of General Nimri. Mengistu's government almost failed to silence the EDU, who later joined the rebel forces against his government. 3. The government of Mengistu was faced with constant Eritrean secessionist rebellion. At the same time, Mengistu's regime was engaged in a full-scale war with Somalia over the Ogaden territory until 1978. These military confrontations strained the Derg government and the Ethiopian economy at large. 4. Internally, there were increased political instabilities in Ethiopia that the government of Mengistu failed to contain. The Tiger People's Liberation Front (TPLF) in the north joined hands with other minor ethnic groups to form a military alliance in the name of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front under Meles Zenawi. Consequently, this military alliance caused the downfall of Mengistu and the Derg. 5. The land policy that was reformed by Mengistu did not benefit all Ethiopians. While only 700,000 households were beneficiaries, majority of the Ethiopians, especially in the south, were not rescued from the customary form of land ownership that affected them severely. They were subjected to feudalism and serfdom. The inconsistent land policy of the Derg therefore reduced the popularity of the Derg, especially in the southern region. 6. The nationalization policy on land led to famine. The policy caused decline in agricultural production, leading to severe food shortage. Following the nationalization, the government put much emphasis on state farms that promoted large capital-intensive farming with interest in cash crops, as the peasant sector was ignored. Ethiopians embarked on coffee and cotton production at the expense of food crops, which led to starvation. 7. There were rebellions organized by elites who were not impressed by the socialist policies of Mengistu's government. Due to this opposition, the government transferred students, teachers, and other educated groups to rural areas under the guise of carrying out literacy campaigns. However, instead of silencing them, the educated masses began politicizing the peasants with an aim of preparing ground for their recruitment against Mengistu's government. 8. Mengistu failed to contain internal divisions within the Derg. There were ideological conflicts between members who sympathized with socialism and those against the policy. Power struggles continued eating up the Derg, which forced Mengistu to arrest and kill his rivals in the Derg. The Derg members selectively eliminated were Bant, Nofarbit, and Amanandam. 9. Consequently, Mengistu Haile Mariam became a military dictator who replaced the aristocrat dictatorship of Selassie. He abolished parliament even when it was African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 11. Generally, the famine catastrophe continued even when the Derg tried to give humanitarian assistance to the affected masses. Starvation and suffering continued up to 1978. The humanitarian assistance was not enough to satisfy the expectations of the masses, and this tested the popularity of Mengistu. 12. The revolutionary government of Mengistu failed in her efforts to improve on the labor conditions. The minimum wage remained on paper while job registration was not implemented to ensure job security. The high levels of inflation froze the workers' wages, strikes were banned, and trade union leaders were imprisoned. The military government was hence discredited. 13. Poverty was not wiped out of Ethiopia. Many of the masses remained unemployed, suffered from economic constraints, and survived on government handouts. By the time of the overthrow of Mengistu and Derg, the economic situation in Ethiopia was appalling. 14. Mengistu embarked on intensive militarization at the expense of other government departments. Mega military deals with the Soviet Union and Cuba made Mengistu to spend a lot of Ethiopian resources on communist artillery, while other sectors of the Ethiopian society were underfunded. 15. With the above weaknesses that characterized the regime of Mengistu and the junta military regime, the Derg could not continue in power. The Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front Meles Zenawi opened up a guerrilla war against Mengistu, which later led to the downfall of the Derg in 1991. A transitional government was put in place led by Meles Zenawi. 16. After making a new constitution, Ethiopia returned to civilian rule. Elections were held, and Meles Zenawi overwhelmingly emerged as the winner. He became the first executive prime minister of Ethiopia in 1995, a position he until his death. Egyptian Revolution 1952–70. Egypt was part of the ancient Ottoman Turkish Empire. However, by 1882 the British had occupied Egypt. The British conquest of Egypt was aimed at controlling and securing the Suez Canal in order to collect funds and pay the European financiers of the Suez project. Egypt became officially a British protectorate during World War I. In 1922, the British granted Egypt a pseudo-theoretical independence. Practically, the British continued controlling the economy of Egypt and significantly the Suez Canal. The Egyptian monarchy remained solely dependent on the British for protection and for military and economic aid. King Farouk, who succeeded his father Fuad in 1936, ensured the continuity of the status quo of British influence in the Egyptian monarchical affairs. The leadership of King Farouk was characterized by corruption and economic and social hardships, with a remarkable gap between the rich and the poor. During World War II, King Farouk allowed the Germans of Axis powers to establish their military camp of the Africa Corps in the northern port city of Alexandria, a time when the African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa became stronger and committed after the defeat of a collective Arab resistance against the newly created Israeli nation in the Palestinian crisis of 1948–49. The surviving Free Army officers of the Palestinian War blamed King Farouk for supplying them with inadequate essentials and inferior arms. The Free Army officers, upon return from Palestine, established a special committee, the Revolutionary Command Council, with Nasser, Abdel, Anwar Sadat and Mohammed Naguib as the influential figures. 1. The Revolutionary Command Council cited many socio-economic, political and religious problems during the reign of Farouk, which forced them to organize a coup d'etat. The Free Army officers set 1954 as the year for the coup, but the local intelligence network of King Farouk acquired information on a planned military coup by a section of the army and arranged to arrest the coup plotters. In order to preempt the proposed arrest over treason charges, there was inactive in Arab affairs. The continued presence of the British in the Suez Canal zone led Egypt to its position of influence in the middle. The British took charge of the region and predetermined the Egyptian foreign policy as a means to safeguard British interests and to encourage Jewish influence in the Middle East at the expense of Egypt. The climax came with the defeat of a collective Arab force with Egypt in the 1948–49 Palestinian crisis. King Farouk was blamed for providing his army with inferior weapons and reluctantly sending his soldiers the necessary logistics while in Palestine. Social factors. 2. The king practiced nepotism as he favored only his relatives, members of the royal family and friends. The fatty and lucrative jobs, especially in his government, went only to his relatives and members of the Wafd party. Such nepotism was also witnessed in the allocation of position of influence in the army in the early July 1952. Premier Mustafa Nahas proposed the appointment of Naguib as the Minister of War and Defense, but King Farouk rejected the proposal, appointed his relative to the post, and went ahead to dismiss Nahas from the premiership. Hence, it took the army to organize AQIP in order to reverse this nepotism. 3. Consequently, there was provision of inadequate social services during the reign of King Farouk. The few social infrastructures available were poor and could not provide quality services for better social welfare of the Egyptian society. The available education institutions were based on the British education system, with English as a medium of teaching. The health centers were also few, concentrated in urban areas like Ismailia, Cairo and Alexandria. The military coup was therefore aimed at solving the socio-economic problems in Egypt. It should be noted that due to poor health services, the Egyptians died of common diseases like bilharzia, malaria and etc. 4. The social stratification class differences in Egypt caused grievances among the masses. The social pyramid was dominated by peasants and a small bourgeoisie. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. 5. The emergency and influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt influenced the overthrow of King Farouk. The Muslim Brotherhood emerged by 1927 under the influence of Hassan al-Banna, qualified elementary teacher who emphasized the revival of Egypt to an Islamic theocratic nation. Members of the Muslim Brotherhood intensified their activities between 1946 and 1951, especially condemning moral decadence that involved womanizing and gambling in casinos, where King Farouk was a great participant. The Brotherhood provoked the arrest and murder of some members, including al-Banna, who was assassinated in 1949. The principles of the Muslim Brotherhood, even after the assassination of its leaders, influenced the revolutionaries to organize a coup in 1952. 6. The appalling social-economic conditions during Farouk's regime made his downfall inevitable. The peasants of Fellahin were exposed to unfair taxation, forced labor, and worst of all, they experienced acute unemployment and abject poverty. The king could do nothing to rescue the peasants from this untold situation. Consequently, the Fellahs continued suffering as the royal family, the Wafdists, and foreigners enjoyed good life. In this case, nationalists like Nasser emerged with socialist ideas aimed at improving the socio-economic situation in Egypt. 7. The religious and cultural conflicts in Egypt favored the overthrow of King Farouk. The existence of the British, who promoted Western cultures and spread Christianity, threatened the existence of Islam and Arabic cultural practices. There were established industries that produced alcohol and many recreation centers. All these were contrary to the Islamic and Arabic principles, where Christianity competed favorably with the Islamic religion. This socio-cultural setback was blamed on King Farouk and hence made his downfall imminent. 8. The famine outbreak increased the anti-Farouk resentment in Egypt. Following the end of World War II, the Fellahin found themselves in a Piaget-Garuda situation that did not enable them to sustain their families with food. This was a result of lack of enough cultivable land, while those that had small pieces of land sold them to large landowners. King Farouk could hardly do anything to solve the food crisis, yet the government policy favoured cash crop-intensive farming for export. 9. King Farouk ignored the status of women in Egypt. The Egyptian women were politically marginalized, had no political participation, nor did they enjoy leadership responsibilities. Hardly could young women acquire education, and a few who did only attain basic education. The most severe treatment of women by Farouk's regime was the death penalty on women for sex morality. It is for this reason that women supported the coup against Isin Farouk. Economic. 10. King Farouk was extremely extravagant and lived a lavish life. He spent much of the money from the Egyptian treasury on satisfying his desires, which included pornography, prostitution, and womanizing. Not only did he spend much of his time. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Industrial development in Egypt led to scarcity of essential commodities, caused unemployment and low levels of development. 12. The high levels of inflation caused the downfall of the regime of King Farouk. King Farouk and the Wafd government failed to solve the economic instability, which was largely a result of economic mismanagement, high corruption, and foreign control of the Egyptian economy. The prices of essential goods were unstable and relatively high for the peasants to afford. The Egyptian currency almost lost value and was dominated by the British pound. This justified the need for a revolution. 13. The persistent unemployment levels led to the 1952 Egyptian coup. The peasants and the middle-class citizens were affected by the acute unemployment that grossly resulted from the poor land tenure system, favoritism of King Farouk, and continued foreign domination of the Egyptian economy. The revolutionaries claimed that the coup was not just a result of political ambitions, but also the desire for socio-economic reforms that could empower the grassroots Egyptian population. 14. The existence of monoculture in Egypt influenced the desire for a revolution. Egypt largely concentrated on growing and exporting cotton against other agricultural opportunities. This restricted the agricultural activities in the end, which affected the country's revenues. On the contrary, the government policy emphasized cash crop production at the expense of food production. This agricultural policy in Egypt was influenced by the British but caused suffering of masses. 15. The poor land tenure system promoted by Farouk's government prepared fertile grounds for his downfall. The king dictated a land policy where he distributed land to members of the royal family and the Wafd party members, who enjoyed a lion's share with the prevailing unfair land tenure system. By 1945, the peasants found themselves in abject poverty due to lack of cultivatable land. By 1952, 65% of the arable land was owned by only 6% of the landlords, mainly from the royal family. The landlords subjected the Fellahin peasants to feudalism and serfdom. This influenced them to support the coup in 1952. Cause of the Egyptian Revolution. Tea Revolution was in simple terms a bloodless revolution that started with the coup on the night of July 22-23, 1952. On the eve of the coup, the British had provoked Egyptians in December 1951 when they bulldozed Egyptian mud brick houses to pave way for the new waterway for British Army installation. On January 25, 1952, the British attacked the Egyptian police barracks in Ismailia after the police officers refused to surrender. Over 50 Egyptians were killed and about 100 wounded. January 26, commonly known as Black Saturday, an Egyptian mob started burning Cairo, targeting British installations such as shops, shelters, and hotels. This was a planned, disciplined action. Serious and more violent riots broke out in Cairo and other provincial cities in June. African history, the United Nations Organization, and the Decolonisation of Africa. A town known as the CIA Monument or Roosevelt Erection was established on Zamalek Island. Farouk was forced to abdicate resign on July 26 after the Free Army officers occupied the city of Alexandria, where the king was on summer holiday at his palace of Muntaza, and forced him to sign an act of abdication before boarding his yacht Marasa with his family and headed to Italy. The revolutionaries enthroned Farouk's son Ford Roman II as his successor, and when Egypt was declared a republic in 1953, General Negwoud, chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council RCC, became president, while Nasser became deputy premier and minister of internal affairs and remained in the shadow until 1954. Following revolutionary misunderstandings between Negwoud and Nasser in November 1954, the latter took over both as president and prime minister executive president. Negwoud was conservative and believed in civilian governance, while Nasser believed that the benefits of the revolution could only be issued through radical means, with the army holding a major position in Egyptian affairs. History has it that early on, in October, Nasser survived an attempted assassination, which he blamed on Negwoud. He accused him of conspiracy, and in the following month, he managed to dismiss him. Hence, Nasser became undisputedly the chairman of the RCC and overall leader of the Republic of Egypt. Factors that led to the success of the Egyptian coup. Revolution. Reference questions. Account for the success of the 1952 Egyptian coup. B. Examine the factors for the success of the Free Army officers in overthrowing of King Farouk. 1. Careful planning by the Revolutionary Command Council enabled the success of the Egyptian revolutionary coup. For 3 years, following their return from the 1948-49 Palestine War, the Free Army officers laid down a framework on how to overthrow the Egyptian monarchy and rid Egypt of British military presence. Little wonder that even after their coup plans of overthrowing Farouk in 1954 were intercepted or exposed, the revolutionaries were quick to change their plan and instead plotted a successful coup in July 1952. 2. The revolutionary character of Nasser enabled the success of the Free Army officers against the Egyptian monarchy. Nasser, at 34 years, was the youngest of the members of the Revolutionary Command Council. A hero of the Palestinian War, Nasser was deeply opposed to the incompetence and corruption of Farouk's government, whom he blamed for the Palestinian defeat. Nasser was a tactical and patient officer, secretive by nature and driven by fierce personal ambitions. Nasser was the brain behind the formation of the Free Officers Movement Society of Free African History, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. These carried out underground operations. The Free Army officers announced their existence, mobilized popularity, and denounced Farouk's regime through leaflets. The Society of Officers clearly spelled out the aims of the revolution, i.e., to win Egypt's independence, liquidation of feudalism, formation of a powerful popular army, need to establish social equality and a healthy domestic life. The Free Army officers launched successful expeditions, attacks on the radio station, telegraph offices, police posts, army and government headquarters before the coup was declared on July 23, 1952. 4. The appointment of General Neguib Mohammed as chairman of the Revolutionary African History, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Attract respect and support for the coup. The announcement of the army's seizure takeover of power was made by General Neguib in a radio broadcast at 7 am on the morning of July 23, 1952. 5. The weakness of the Egyptian monarch or weak character of King Farouk enabled the success of the 1952 coup. In July 1952, while enjoying his habitual gambling sessions in Alexandria, King Farouk received an urgent call from Prime Minister Hassan Souri warning him of a planned coup by a small group of dissident rebellious officers in the army. Farouk only referred to the coup plotters, Nasser, and his friends as a bunch of pimps and did not take the matter serious. Such arrogant and weak nature of the monarch king could not safeguard Farouk's government even after the information on a planned coup leaked. 6. The absence of King Farouk from Cairo became a great opportunity to the Free Army officers. In order to escape the heat and hubbub noise of Cairo, Farouk had camped with his family and household staff at the luxurious Monteza Palace on the beachfront at Alexandria. The king had planned to spend the entire summer in Alexandria, which was about 125 miles far away from Cairo. Farouk left Cairo amidst mass riots, assassinations, and political violence by the Muscat Brotherhood and an angry city mob. This enabled the leadership of the Free Army officers to take advantage of the situation in Cairo and overthrow the Egyptian monarchy. 7. The coup occurred at a time when King Farouk and the Egyptian monarchy were unpopular. Farouk was arrogant, extravagant, and spent lavishly from the Egyptian treasury. He was the largest landholder in Egypt, had 4 luxurious palaces, owned 2 yachts, 13 private jets, a fleet of 200 cars, and a huge collection of pornographic materials. A prominent gambler and womanizer, Farouk enjoyed a pretty expensive life at the expense of the suffering and landless fellas. He was the envy of all Egyptians and therefore had no sympathy for masses that would have saved his throne. The unpopularity on King Farouk hence led to the success of his own downfall. 8. The attack and capture of the army headquarters made the success of the coup inevitable. On learning of a meeting held by Farouk's army generals at the army headquarters, the Society of Free Officers decided to attack the building while the generals were inside. The generals had assembled to prepare a plan of action against African History, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. African History, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa immediately appointed a new prime minister and installed his brother-in-law as minister of war to round up the military conspirators, coup plotters, but this was too late to prevent his overthrow. Even during the attack on his palace at Monteza, his security was too weak to prevent the capture of Farouk. Then, isolation of the Egyptian army generals from their revolutionary preparations kept the coup plan secret for most of the time, hence contributing to its success. The Free Army officers usually met at night in what had been Farouk's yacht house on an island in the Nile, hence keeping their identities hidden. The Revolutionary Command Council did not reveal any detailed plan to all members of the Society of Free Officers. Communication to the masses and within the movement was through a series of underground leaflet circulars. This kept the entire Egyptian army Roman ignorant of any revolutionary plans. 11. The seizure capture of communication centers and police posts ensured the success of the revolutionaries. By the early hours of July 23, 1952, the Free Army officers had taken control of the radio station, telegraph offices, police posts and government buildings. The capture of the police post helped the Free Army officers to deter a possible counter-revolution, while the capture of the radio station and telegraph offices ensured the spread of revolutionary propaganda. Negwip, the appointed chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council (RCC), used the captured radio station Radio Cairo to announce the army's seizure of power. 12. The elimination of the British enabled the Free Army officers to take over government control. The Revolutionary Command Council deployed an armoured-equipped military convoy to block the highway from the Suez Canal zone so as to prevent British troops from intervening on behalf of de-pound Farak's government. The Suez Canal zone was a British military base with about 80,000 soldiers. The blockade on the Suez Highway and the cutting of communication lines between the Suez City and Cairo enabled the coup plotters to carry out their coup plan with no strong resistance from the British allies of the Egyptian monarchy. 13. The common grievances in the Egyptian society at the time the military coup was organized inspired the success of the Society of Free Officers. The majority of the fellows had been affected by abject poverty, lack of cultivatable land, unemployment, acute inflation, and were mostly tired of the immoral, corrupt, and African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa. Within the RCC on whether to eliminate Farak through execution or to exile him. Negwip and Nasser chose to spare his life but send him to exile. Hence the Free Army officers surrounded Farak's palace of Muntazah and made him to sign an act of abdication on July 26, 1952 before boarding his yacht known as Marasa with his family and headed to Italy. 15. The coup against King Farak was financed by the US Central Intelligence Agency CIA. The Revolutionary Command Council of the Society of Free Officers received a financial grant from the CIA to a tune of $12 million to enable effective organization and planning. Farak tried to solicit US intervention, but it was too late for his government to be saved as the Americans had already conspired with the coup plotters. Effects of the Egyptian coup of 1952. Achievements of the revolution. Note: the impact of the Egyptian revolution coup is attributed to Nasser, therefore without Nasser the revolution could not have achieved tremendously. Many of the scores of the revolution were during the reign of Nasser as the chairman of the RCC and head of the revolutionary government. The aftermath of the 1952 Egyptian coup largely explained the career and success of Abdel Gamal Nasser up to 1970. The Egyptian revolution had both achievements and weaknesses. It was therefore African history, the United Nations Organsation, and the Decolonisation of Africa.